David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Read by Simon Callow. I was born at Blunderston in Suffolk. I was a posthumous child. My father's eyes had closed upon the light of this world 6 months before mine opened on it. An aunt of my father's was the principal magnate of our family. Her name was Miss Trotwood, or Miss Betsy. One day my mother was sitting by the fire, but poorly in health and very low in spirits, looking at it through her tears and desponding heavily about herself and the fatherless little stranger yet to be born. Lifting her eyes as she dried them to the window opposite, she saw a strange lady coming up the garden. "Mrs. David Copperfield, I think," said Miss Betsy. "Yes," said my mother, faintly. "Miss Trotwood," said the visitor. My mother bent her head and begged her to walk in. They went into the parlour my mother had come from. "Take off your cap, child," said Miss Betsy, "and let me see you." My mother was too much afraid of her to refuse compliance with this odd request. "Why, bless my heart," exclaimed Miss Betsy, "you are a very baby. Well, and when do you expect—" "I am all in a tremble," faltered my mother. "I don't know what's the matter. I shall die, I am sure." "No, no, no, no," said Miss Betsy. "Have some tea." "Oh, dear me, do you think it will do me any good?" cried my mother. "Of course it will," said Miss Betsy. "It's nothing but fancy. What do you call your girl?" "I don't know that it will be a girl yet, ma'am," said my mother, innocently. "Bless the baby," exclaimed Miss Betsy. "I don't mean that. I mean your servant girl." "Peggotty," said my mother. "Peggotty?" repeated Miss Betsy with some indignation. "Do you mean to say, child, that any human being has gone into a Christian church and got herself named Peggotty?" "It's her surname," said my mother, faintly. "Mr. Copperfield called her by it because her Christian name was the same as mine." "Here, Peggotty," cried Miss Betsy, opening the parlour door. "Tea. Your mistress is a little unwell. Don't dawdle." My mother was so much worse that Peggotty, coming in with the tea-board and candles and seeing at a glance how ill she was, immediately dispatched Ham Peggotty, her nephew, who had been for some days past secreted in the house as a special messenger in case of emergency, to fetch the nurse and doctor. The doctor came straight away, but it was midnight before he sidled into the parlour and said to my aunt in his meekest manner, "Well, ma'am, I am happy to congratulate you." "How is she?" said my aunt. "Well, ma'am, she will soon be quite comfortable, I hope," returned the doctor, "quite as comfortable as we can expect a young mother to be under these melancholy domestic circumstances." "And she? How is she?" said my aunt, sharply. Mr. Chillip, for such was the doctor's name, laid his head on one side and looked at my aunt like an amiable bird. "The baby," said my aunt. "How is she?" "Ma'am," returned Mr. Chillip, "I apprehended you had known. It's a boy." My aunt said never a word, but took her bonnet by the strings in the manner of a sling, aimed a blow at Mr. Chillip's head with it, put it on bent, walked out, and never came back. She vanished like a discontented fairy, and never came back any more. Looking back into my infancy, the first objects I can remember as standing out by themselves from a confusion of things are my mother and Peggotty. Peggotty and I were sitting one night by the parlour fire, alone. I had been reading to Peggotty about crocodiles. We exhausted the crocodiles and had begun with the alligators when the garden bell rang. We went out to the door, and there was my mother, looking unusually pretty, I thought, and with her a gentleman with beautiful black hair and whiskers. He patted me on the head, but somehow I didn't like him or his deep voice, and I was jealous that his hand should touch my mother's in touching me, which it did. I put it away as well as I could. "Let us say good night, my fine boy," said the gentleman, when he had bent his head. "Good night," said I. "Come, let us be the best friends in the world," said the gentleman, laughing. "Shake hands." My right hand was in my mother's left, so I gave him the other. "Why, that's the wrong hand, Davy," laughed the gentleman. My mother drew my right hand forward, but I was resolved not to give it to him. I gave him the other, and he shook it heartily and said I was a brave little fellow, and went away. At this minute I see him turn round in the garden and give us a last look with his ill-omened black eyes before the door was shut. Gradually I became used to seeing the gentleman with the black whiskers, whose name I learnt was Mr. Murdstone. I liked him no better than at first, and had the same uneasy jealousy of him. Peggotty and I were sitting as before one evening when Peggotty said coaxingly, "Master Davy, how should you like to go along with me and spend a fortnight at my brother's at Yarmouth? Wouldn't that be a treat?" "Is your brother an agreeable man, Peggotty?" I inquired provisionally. "Oh, what an agreeable man he is," cried Peggotty. "Then there's the sea and the boats and ships and the fishermen and the beach and Ham to play with." Peggotty meant her nephew, Ham. "But what is Mother to do while we're away?" said I. "She can't live by herself." "Oh, bless you," said Peggotty. "Don't you know? She's going to stay for a fortnight with Mrs. Graper. Mrs. Graper's going to have a lot of company." Oh, if that was it, I was quite ready to go, and so it was arranged. Peggotty and I were met at Yarmouth by Ham, who took us to Peggotty's home. We turned down lanes bestrewn with bits of chips and little hillocks of sand and went past gasworks, rope walks, boat builders' yards, and a great litter of such places, until we came out upon the dull waste I had already seen at a distance, when Ham said, "Yon's our house, Master Davy." I looked in all directions so far as I could stare over the wilderness, but no house could I make out. There was a black barge, not far off, high and dry on the ground, with an iron funnel sticking out of it for a chimney, and smoking very cosily. "That's not it," said I, "that ship-looking thing." "That's it, Master Davy," returned Ham. If it had been Aladdin's palace, I suppose I could not have been more charmed with the romantic idea of living in it. We were welcomed by a very civil woman in a white apron, likewise by a most beautiful little girl, or so I thought her, with a necklace of blue beads on, who wouldn't let me kiss her when I offered to, but ran away and hid herself. By and by, when we had dined, a hairy man with a very good-natured face came home. He was Peggotty's brother, being presently introduced to me as Mr. Peggotty, the master of the house. "Glad to see you, sir," said Mr. Peggotty. "You'll find us rough, sir, but you'll find us ready." I thanked him, and replied that I was sure I should be happy in such a delightful place. "How's your ma, sir?" said Mr. Peggotty. "Did you leave her pretty jolly?" I gave Mr. Peggotty to understand that she was as jolly as I could wish. My eyes returned to the little girl who had run away when I had tried to kiss her, and only returned when dinner had been served. Of course, I was in love with little Emily, for such was her name. We used to walk about that dim old flat at Yarmouth in a loving manner, hours and hours. The days sported by us as if time had not grown upon himself yet, but were a child too, and always at play. I told Emily I adored her, and that unless she confessed she adored me, I should be reduced to the necessity of killing myself with a sword. She said she did, and I have no doubt she did. Now, all the time I was on my visit, I thought little or nothing about my home. But I was no sooner turned towards it than my reproachful young conscience seemed to point that way with a ready finger. Peggotty and I were on the threshold of our house when she began to speak, hesitatingly, and not looking me in the eye. "You see, dear, I should have told you before now," said Peggotty, "but I hadn't an opportunity. I ought to have made it, perhaps, but I couldn't exactly bring my mind to it." "Go on, Peggotty," said I, quite frightened. "Master Davy," said Peggotty, untying her bonnet with a shaking hand and speaking in a breathless sort of way, What do you think? You've got a pa." I trembled and turned white. Something, I don't know what or how, connected with the grave in a churchyard and the raising of the dead, seemed to strike me like an unwholesome wind. "A new one," said Peggotty. "A new one?" I repeated. Peggotty gave a gasp, as if she was swallowing something that was very hard, and, putting out her hands, said, "Come and see him." "I don't want to see him." "And your mamma?" said Peggotty. I ceased to draw back, and we went straight to the best parlour, where she left me. On one side of the fire sat my mother, on the other, Mr. Murdstone. My mother dropped her work and arose hurriedly, but timidly, I thought. "Now, Clara, my dear," said Mr. Murdstone, "recollect, control yourself, always control yourself. Davy boy, how do you do?" I gave him my hand. After a moment of suspense, I went and kissed my mother. She kissed me, patted me gently on the shoulder, and sat down again to her work. I could not look at her. I could not look at him. I knew quite well that he was looking at us both, and I turned to the window and looked out there at some shrubs that were drooping their heads in the cold. We dined alone, we three together. He seemed to be very fond of my mother. I'm afraid I liked him none the better for that, and she was very fond of him. I gathered from what they said that an elder sister of his was coming to stay with them, and that she was expected that evening. Miss Murdstone arrived, and a gloomy-looking lady she was, dark like her brother, and with very heavy eyebrows, as if being disabled by the wrongs of her sex from wearing whiskers, she had carried them to that account. "Is that your boy, sister-in-law?" My mother acknowledged me. "Generally speaking," said Miss Murdstone, "I don't like boys. How do you do, boy?" Under these encouraging circumstances, I replied that I was very well, that I hoped she was the same, with such an indifferent grace that Miss Murdstone disposed of me in 2 words. "Wants manners." Let me remember how it used to be, and bring one morning back again. I come into the second-best parlour after breakfast with my books and an exercise book and a slate. I hand the first book to my mother. I start off aloud at a racing pace while I've got it fresh. I trip over a word. Mr. Murdstone looks up. I trip over another. Miss Murdstone looks up. I redden and stop. My mother says softly, "Oh, Davy, Davy." "Now, Clara," said Mr. Murdstone, "be firm with the boy. He knows his lesson, or he does not know it." "He does not know it," Miss Murdstone interposes awfully. I'm really afraid he does not," says my mother. "Then you see, Clara," returns Miss Murdstone, "you should just give him the book back and make him know it." Yes, certainly," says my mother. That is what I intend to do, my dear Jane. Now, Davy, try once more, and don't be stupid." The natural result of this treatment, continued, I suppose, for some 6 months or more, was to make me sullen, dull, and dogged. I was not made the less so by my sense of being daily more and more shut out and alienated from my mother. Then one morning Miss Murdstone appeared, as usual, and told me I was going to school. She also informed me that when I was dressed, I was to come downstairs into the parlour and have my breakfast. There I found my mother, very pale and with red eyes, into whose arms I ran and begged her pardon from my suffering soul. "Oh, Davy," she said, "that you could hurt anyone I love. Try to be better. Pray to be better. I forgive you, but I am so grieved, Davy, that you should have such bad passions in your heart." "Master Copperfield's box there," said Miss Murdstone, when wheels were heard at the gate. I looked for Peggotty, but it was not she. Neither she nor Mr. Murdstone appeared. Miss Murdstone was good enough to take me out to the cart and to say on the way that she hoped I would repent before I came to a bad end. And then I got into the cart, and the lazy horse walked off with it. We might have gone about half a mile, and my pocket-handkerchief was quite wet through when the carrier stopped short. Looking out to ascertain for what, I saw, to my amazement, Peggotty burst from a hedge and climb into the cart. She took me in both her arms and squeezed me to her stays until the pressure on my nose was extremely painful. Not a single word did Peggotty speak. Releasing one of her arms, she put it down in her pocket to the elbow and brought out some paper bags of cakes which she crammed into my pockets and a purse which she put into my hand, but not one word did she say. After another and a final squeeze with both arms, she got down from the cart and ran away. After we had jogged on for some little time, I asked the carrier if he was going all the way. "All the way where?" inquired the carrier. "There," I said. "Where's there?" inquired the carrier. "Near London," I said. "Why, that horse," said the carrier, jerking the rein to point him out, "would be deader than pork before he got over half the ground." I offered him a cake, which he ate at one gulp, exactly like an elephant, and which made no more impression on his big face than it would have done on an elephant's. "Does she make 'em now?" said Mr. Barkis, always leaning forward in his slouching way on the footboard of the cart with an arm on each knee. "Peggotty, do you mean, sir?" "Ah," said Mr. Barkis. "Her." Yes, she makes all our pastry and does all our cooking." "Do she, though?" said Mr. Barkis. He made up his mouth as if to whistle, but he didn't whistle. By and by, he said, "Well, I'll tell you what," said Mr. Barkis. "Perhaps you might be writing to her." "I shall certainly write to her," I rejoined. "Ah," he said, slowly turning his eyes towards me. "Well, if you was writing to her, perhaps you'd recollect to say that Barkis was willing, would you?" "That Barkis is willing," I repeated innocently. Is that all the message?" "Yes," he said, considering.
Yes, Barkis is willing.
While I was waiting for the coach in the hotel at Yarmouth that very afternoon, I procured a sheet of paper and an inkstand and wrote a note to Peggotty, which ran thus: "My dear Peggotty, I have come here safe. Barkis is willing. My love to Mamma, yours affectionately. P.S. He says he particularly wants you to know Barkis is willing." Salem House was a square brick building of a bare and unfurnished appearance. All about it was so very quiet that I said to Mr. Mell, the master who greeted me, I supposed the boys were out, but he seemed surprised at my not knowing that it was holiday time. That all the boys were at their several homes, that Mr. Creakle, the proprietor, was down by the seaside with Mrs. and Miss Creakle, and that I was sent in holiday time as a punishment for my misdoing. Mr. Sharp was the first master, and superior to Mr. Mell. Mr. Mell took his meals with the boys, but Mr. Sharp dined and supped at Mr. Creakle's table. He was a limp, delicate-looking gentleman, I thought, with a good deal of nose, and a way of carrying his head on one side as if it were a little too heavy for him. His hair was very smooth and wavy, but I was informed by the very first boy who came back that it was a wig, a second-hand one, he said, and that Mr. Sharp went out every Saturday afternoon to get it curled. It was no other than Tommy Traddles who gave me this piece of intelligence. He was the first boy who returned. However, I was not considered as being formally received into the school until J. Steerforth arrived. Before this boy, who was reputed to be a great scholar and was very good-looking, and at least half a dozen years my senior, I was carried as before a magistrate. "What money have you got, Copperfield?" he said. I told him 7 shillings. "You'd better give it to me to take care of," he said. "At least you can if you like. You needn't if you don't like." I hastened to comply with his friendly suggestion. "Do you want to spend anything now?" he asked me. "No, thank you," I replied. "You can if you like, you know," said Steerforth. "Say the word." "No, thank you, sir," I repeated. "Perhaps you'd like to spend a couple of shillings or so in a bottle of currant wine by and by up in the bedroom," said Steerforth. "You belong to my bedroom, I find." It certainly had not occurred to me before, but I said, "Yes, I should like that." "Very good," said Steerforth. "You'll be glad to spend another shilling or so in almond cakes, I dare say?" I said, "Yes, I should like that too. And another shilling or so in biscuits, and another in fruit, eh?" said Steerforth. "I say, young Copperfield, you're going it." I smiled because he smiled, but I was a little troubled in my mind too. "Well," said Steerforth, "we must make it stretch as far as we can, that's all." When we went upstairs to bed, he produced the whole 7 shillings worth and laid it out on my bed in the moonlight, saying, "There you are, young Copperfield, and a royal spread you've got." How well I recollect our sitting there talking in whispers, or there talking and my respectfully listening, I ought rather to say. I heard all kinds of things about the school and all belonging to it. The hearing of this and a good deal more outlasted the banquet some time. The greater part of the guests had gone to bed as soon as the eating and drinking were over, and Steerforth and I, who had remained whispering and listening, half undressed, at last betook ourselves to bed too. "Good night, young Copperfield," said Steerforth. "I'll take care of you." "You're very kind," I gratefully returned. "I am very much obliged to you." "You haven't got a sister, have you?" said Steerforth, yawning. "No," I answered. "That's a pity," said Steerforth. "You had one. I should think she would have been a pretty, timid, little bright-eyed sort of girl. I should have liked to know her. Good night, young Copperfield." "Good night, sir," I replied. Steerforth continued his protection of me and proved a very useful friend, since nobody dared to annoy one whom he honoured with his countenance. He couldn't, or at all events he didn't, defend me from Mr. Creakle, who was very severe with me. But whenever I had been treated worse than usual, he always told me that I wanted a little of his pluck and that he wouldn't have stood it himself, which I felt he intended for encouragement and considered to be very kind of him. There was only one other event in this half-year out of the daily school life that made an impression upon me which still survives. It survives for many reasons. One afternoon, Mr. Creakle called out in his usual strong way, "Visitors for Copperfield." I stood up on the announcement being made and was told to go by the back stairs and get a clean frill on before I repaired to the dining room. First I saw nobody. but feeling a pressure against the door, I looked round, and there, to my amazement, were Mr. Peggotty and Ham. Mr. Peggotty, who never shut his mouth once, I remember, during the visit, nudged Ham to say something.
"Why, how you have growed,"
said Ham in his simpering way. "Am I grown?" I said, drying my eyes. I was not crying at anything in particular that I know of, but somehow it made me cry to see old friends.
"Ain't he growed?"
said Mr. Peggotty. They made me laugh by laughing at each other, and then we all three laughed until I was in danger of crying. "Do you know how Mamma is, Mr. Peggotty?" I said, "and how my dear, dear old Peggotty is?"
"Uncommon,"
said Mr. Peggotty. "And little Em'ly?"
"Uncommon," said Mr. Peggotty. "She's getting to be a woman, that's what she's getting to be. Ask him."
He meant Ham, who beamed with delight.
"Her pretty face,"
said Mr. Peggotty, with his own shining like a light.
"Her learning," said Ham. "Her writing," said Mr. Peggotty.
It was perfectly delightful to behold with what enthusiasm Mr. Peggotty became inspired when he thought of his little favourite. Ham was quite as earnest as he. I dare say they would have said much more about her if they had not been abashed by the unexpected coming in of Steerforth. "Steerforth," said I, "these are 2 Yarmouth boatmen, very kind, good people, who are relations of my nurse and have come to see me." "Aye, aye," said Steerforth, returning. "I'm glad to see them. How are you both?" There was an ease in his manner, a gay and light manner it was, but not swaggering, which I still believe to have borne a kind of enchantment with it. I could not but see how pleased they were with him, and how they seemed to open their hearts to him in a moment. "You must let them know at home, if you please, Mr. Peggotty," I said, "that Mr. Steerforth is very kind to me, and that I don't know what I should ever do here without him." "Nonsense," said Steerforth, laughing. "You mustn't tell them anything of the sort." "And if Mr. Steerforth ever comes into Norfolk or Suffolk, Mr. Peggotty," I said, "while I am there, you may depend upon it I shall bring him to Yarmouth, if he will let me, to see your house. You never saw such a good house, Steerforth. It's made out of a boat." "Made out of a boat, is it?" said Steerforth. "It's the right sort of house for such a thorough-built boatman."
"So 'tis, sir, so 'tis, sir," said Ham, grinning. "You're right, young gentleman. Master Davy Bore, gentleman's right. A thorough-built boatsman, or that's what he is, too."
Mr. Peggotty was no less pleased than his nephew, though his modesty forbade him to claim a personal compliment so vociferously.
"Well, sir," he said, bowing and chuckling and tucking in the ends of his neckerchief at his breast. "Oh, thank ye, sir. Oh, thank ye."
Ham echoed this sentiment, and we parted with them in the heartiest manner. I pass over all that happened at school until the anniversary of my birthday came round in March. Except that Steerforth was more to be admired than ever, I remember nothing until that fateful day I will never forget. It was after breakfast, and we had been summoned in from the playground when Mr. Sharp entered and said, "David Copperfield is to go into the parlour."
"David Copperfield," said Mrs. Creakle, leading me to a sofa and sitting down beside me, "I want to speak to you very particularly. I have something to tell you, my child."
I looked at her earnestly.
"When you came away from home at the end of the vacation," said Mrs. Creakle, "was your mamma well?"
I trembled, without distinctly knowing why, and looked at her earnestly, making no attempt to answer.
"Because," said she, "I grieve to tell you that I hear this morning your mamma is very ill."
A mist rose between Mrs. Creakle and me, and her figure seemed to move in it for an instant. Then I felt the burning tears run down my face, and it was steady again.
"She is very dangerously ill," she added.
I knew all now.
"She is dead."
There was no need to tell me so. I had already broken out into a desolate cry and felt an orphan in the wide world. I left Salem House upon the morrow afternoon. I little thought then that I left it never to return. In the days before the funeral I saw but little of Peggotty, except that in passing up or downstairs I always found her close to the room where my mother lay, and except that she came to me every night and sat by my bed's head while I went to sleep. If the funeral had been yesterday, I could not recollect it better. We stand around the grave. There is a solemn hush, which we have brought from home with what is resting in the mould. And while we stand bareheaded, I hear the voice of the clergyman sounding remote in the open air, and yet distinct and plain, saying, I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. The first act of business Miss Murdstone performed when the day of the solemnity was over was to give Peggotty a month's warning. Much as Peggotty would have disliked such a service, I believe she would have retained it for my sake in preference to the best upon earth. She told me we must part and told me why, and we condoled with one another in all sincerity. As to me or my future, not a word was said or a step taken. Happy they would have been, I dare say, if they could have dismissed me at a month's warning too. Peggotty, I said, in a thoughtful whisper one evening, when I was warming my hands at the kitchen fire, Mr. Murdstone likes me less than he used to. He never liked me much, Peggotty, but he would rather not even see me now if he can help it. I'm a-going, Davy, to my brother's for a fortnight visit, she said, after a while, just till I have had time to look about me and get to be something like myself again. Now, I've been thinking that perhaps, as they don't want you here at present, you might be let to go along with me. If anything, short of being in a different relation to everyone about me, Peggotty excepted, could have been given a sense of pleasure at that time, it would have been this project of all others. It was ruffled, next moment, to be sure, by a doubt of Miss Murdstone's giving her consent, but even that was set at rest soon, for she came out to take an evening grope in the store closet while we were yet in conversation, and Peggotty, with a boldness that amazed me, broached the topic on the spot. The boy will be idle there, said Miss Murdstone, looking into a pickle jar. And idleness is the root of all evil. But to be sure, he would be idle here, or anywhere, in my opinion. Peggotty had an angry answer ready, I could see, but she swallowed it for my sake and remained silent. Humph, said Miss Murdstone, still keeping her eye on the pickles. It is of more importance than anything else. It is of paramount importance that my brother should not be disturbed or made uncomfortable. I suppose I had better say yes. The permission was given and was never retracted, for when the month was out, Peggotty and I were ready to depart. Peggotty was naturally in low spirits at leaving what had been her home so many years, and she got into the cart and sat in it with her handkerchief at her eyes as Mr. Barkis drove the cart on. Mr. Peggotty and Ham received me and Peggotty in an affectionate manner and shook hands with Mr. Barkis. They each took one of Peggotty's trunks, and we were going away when Mr. Barkis solemnly made a sign to me with his forefinger to come under an archway.
I say,
growled Mr. Barkis.
It was all right.
I looked up into his face and answered with an attempt to be very profound, Oh.
You know who was willing?
Said my friend.
It was Barkis, and Barkis only.
I nodded assent.
It's all right, said Mr. Barkis, shaking hands. I'm a friend of yourn. You made it all right first. It's all right.
In his attempts to be particularly lucid, Mr. Barkis was so extremely mysterious. After dinner, we all sat together.
And how's your friend, sir?
Said Mr. Peggotty to me. Steerforth, said I.
That's the name,
cried Mr. Peggotty. He was very well indeed when I came away, Mr. Peggotty.
There's a friend, said Mr. Peggotty, stretching out his pipe. There's a friend, if you talk of friends. Why, Lord love my heart alive, it ain't a treat to look at him.
He is very handsome, is he not? Said I, my heart warming with this praise.
Handsome, cried Mr. Peggotty. He stands up to you like a... Why, I don't know what he don't stand up to you like. He's so bold.
Yes, that's just his character, said I. He's as brave as a lion, and you can't think how frank he is, Mr. Peggotty.
And I do suppose now, said Mr. Peggotty, looking at me through the smoke of his pipe, that in the way of book learning, he'd take the wind out of almost anything.
Yes, said I, delighted. He knows everything. He's astonishingly clever. I was running on very fast indeed, when my eyes rested on little Emily's face, which was bent forward over the table, listening with the deepest attention, her breath held, her blue eyes sparkling like jewels, and the colour mantling in her cheeks. She looked so extraordinarily earnest and pretty that I stopped in a sort of wonder, and they all observed her at the same time, for as I stopped, they laughed and looked at her. Emily's like me, said Peggotty, and would like to see him. The days passed pretty much as they had passed before, except, it was a great exception, that little Emily and I seldom wandered on the beach now. Wild and full of childish whims as Emily was, she was more of a little woman than I had supposed. She seemed to have got a great distance away from me in little more than a year. At length, when the term of my visit was nearly expired, it was given out that Peggotty and Mr. Barkis were going to make a day's holiday together, and that little Emily and I were to accompany them. The first thing we did was to stop at a church, where Mr. Barkis tied the horse to some rails and went in with Peggotty, leaving little Emily and me alone in the chaise.
"What name was it as I wrote up in the cart?" asked Mr. Barkis, when at last he and Peggotty emerged.
Clara Peggotty, I answered.
"What name would it be as I should write up now if there was a tilt here?"
Clara Peggotty again, I suggested.
"Clara Peggotty Barkis," he returned, and burst into a roar of laughter that shook the chaise. I've often thought since what an odd, innocent and out-of-the-way kind of wedding it must have been. I took leave of Mr. Peggotty and Ham and little Emily next day. Peggotty and Mr. Barkis left me at the gate, and it was a strange sight to see the cart go on, taking Peggotty away and leaving me looking at the house, in which there was no face to look on mine with love or liking any more. And now I fell into a state of neglect, which I cannot look back upon without compassion. I was not actively ill-used, I was not beaten or starved, but the wrong that was done to me had no intervals of relenting, and was done in a systematic, passionless manner. One morning after breakfast, Mr. Murdstone called me to him. "You have heard the counting-house mentioned sometimes," said Mr. Murdstone. "The counting-house, sir?" I repeated. "Of Murdstone and Grinby in the wine trade," he replied. I suppose I looked uncertain, for he went on hastily, "You have heard the counting-house mentioned, the business, the cellars, or the wharf, or something about it." "I think I have heard the business mentioned, sir," I said, remembering what I vaguely knew of his and his sister's resources, "but I don't know when." "It does not matter when," he returned. "Mr. Quinion manages that business, and Mr. Quinion suggests that it gives employment to some other boys, and that he sees no reason why it shouldn't, on the same terms, give employment to you. In short, you are provided for," observed his sister, "and will please to do your duty." Though I quite understood that the purpose of this announcement was to get rid of me, I have no distinct remembrance whether it pleased or frightened me. My impression is that I was in a state of confusion about it, and oscillating between the 2 points, touched neither. Nor had I much time for the clearing of my thoughts. I was to go upon the morrow. Murdstone and Grinby's warehouse was at the waterside. It was down in Blackfriars. There were 3 or 4 of us, counting me. My working place was established in a corner of the warehouse, where Mr. Quinion could see me, when he chose to stand up on the bottom rail of his stool in the counting-house and look at me through a window above the desk. The counting-house clock was at 12:30, and there was general preparation for going to dinner, when Mr. Quinion tapped at the counting-house window and beckoned to me to go in. I went in and found there a stoutish, middle-aged person in a brown surtout and black tights and shoes, with no more hair upon his head, which was a large one and very shining, than there is upon an egg, and with a very extensive face, which he turned full upon me. His clothes were shabby, but he had an imposing shirt-collar on. He carried a jaunty sort of a stick with a large pair of rusty tassels to it, and a quizzing glass hung outside his coat for ornament, I afterwards found, as he very seldom looked through it and couldn't see anything when he did. "This is Mr. Micawber," said Mr. Quinion to me. "Ahem," said the stranger. "That is my name." "Mr. Micawber," said Mr. Quinion, "is known to Mr. Murdstone. He has been written to by Mr. Murdstone on the subject of your lodgings, and he will receive you as a lodger." "My address," said Mr. Micawber, "is Windsor Terrace, City Road. In short," said Mr. Micawber, with the same genteel air, and in another burst of confidence, "in short, I live there." I made him a bow. At the appointed time in the evening, Mr. Micawber reappeared. I washed my hands and face to do the greater honour to his gentility, and we walked to our house. He presented me to Mrs. Micawber, a thin and faded lady, not at all young, who was sitting in the parlour with a baby at her breast. This baby was one of twins, and I may remark here that I hardly ever, in all my experience of the family, saw both the twins detached from Mrs. Micawber at the same time. One of them was always taking refreshment. There were 2 other children, Master Micawber, aged about 4, and Miss Micawber, aged about 3.
"I never thought," said Mrs. Micawber when she came up, twin and all, to show me the apartment and sat down to take breath, "before I was married, when I lived with Papa and Mamma, that I should ever find it necessary to take a lodger. But Mr. Micawber being in difficulties, all consideration of private feeling must give way." I said, "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Micawber's difficulties are almost overwhelming just at present," said Mrs. Micawber, "and whether it is possible to bring him through them, I don't know." A curious equality of friendship, originating, I suppose, in our respective circumstances, sprung up between me and these people. Eventually, Mr. Micawber's difficulties reached a crisis. One evening after dinner, Mrs. Micawber took me to one side. "My family," said Mrs. Micawber, "are of opinion that Mr. Micawber should quit London and exert his talents in the country. Mr. Micawber is a man of great talent." "Master Copperfield," I said I was sure of that. "And do you go too, ma'am?" I asked. Mrs. Micawber replied with tears, "I never will desert Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber may have concealed his difficulties from me in the first instance, but his sanguine temper may have led him to expect that he would overcome them. I never will desert Mr. Micawber. No," cried Mrs. Micawber, more affected than before, "I never will do it. It's of no use asking me."
"Emma, my angel," cried Mr. Micawber, running into the room, "what is the matter?"
"I never will desert you, Micawber,"
she exclaimed. "My life," said Mr. Micawber, taking her in his arms, "I am perfectly aware of it."
"He is the parent of my children. He is the father of my twins. He is the husband of my affections," cried Mrs. Micawber, struggling, "and I never will desert Micawber."
"My dear young friend," said Micawber, turning to me, "I am older than you, a man of some experience in life, and of some experience, in short, in difficulties, generally speaking. At present, and until something turns up, which I am, I may say, hourly expecting, I have nothing to bestow but advice. My advice, Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, "is this. Annual income £20, annual expenditure 19, 19 and 6, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, ought and 6, result misery. The blossom is blighted, the leaf is withered, the god of day goes down upon the dreary scene, and, in short, you are forever flawed, as I am." I did not fail to assure him that I would store this precept in my mind. Next morning I met the whole family at the coach office and saw them with a desolate heart take their places outside at the back. "Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "God bless you." "Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, "farewell, every happiness and prosperity. In case of anything turning up, of which I am rather confident, I shall be extremely happy if it should be in my power to improve your prospects."
I waved the Micawbers farewell and turned with a heavy heart as I went to begin my weary day at Murdstone and Grinby's, but with no intention of passing many more weary days there, no. No, I had resolved to run away to the only relation I had in the world and tell my story to my aunt, Miss Betsy. As I did not even know where Miss Betsy lived, I wrote a long letter to Peggotty and asked her, incidentally, if she remembered. Peggotty's answer soon arrived and was, as usual, full of affectionate devotion. She told me that Miss Betsy lived near Dover, but whether at Dover itself, at Hythe, Sandgate, or Folkestone, she could not say. One of our men, however, informing me on my asking him about these places that they were all close together, I deemed this enough for my object and resolved to set out at the end of that week, and so, on the next Saturday, I ran away. It was many days of walking before I finally found myself at my aunt's house, tired and feeling not a little hopeless. I watched her with my heart at my lips as she marched to a corner of her garden and stooped to dig up some little root there. Then, without a scrap of courage but with a great deal of desperation, I went softly in and stood beside her, touching her with my finger. "If you please, ma'am," I began. She started and looked up. "If you please," Aunt.
Eh? Exclaimed Miss Betsy in a tone of amazement I have never heard approached. If you please.
Aunt, I am your nephew.
Oh, Lord, said my aunt,
and sat flat down in the garden path. I am David Copperfield of Blunderston in Suffolk, where you came on the night when I was born and saw my dear mamma. I have been very unhappy since she died. I have been slighted and taught nothing and thrown upon myself and put to work not fit for me. It made me run away to you. I have walked all the way and have never slept in a bed since I began the journey. My aunt, with every sort of expression but wonder discharged from her countenance, sat on the gravel staring at me until I began to cry. When she got up in a great hurry, collared me, and took me into the parlour. She rang the bell. "Janet," said my aunt, when her servant came in, "Janet, go upstairs, give my compliments to Mr. Dick, and say I wish to speak to him." My aunt, with her hands behind her, walked up and down the room until the gentleman came in, laughing. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "you have heard me mention David Copperfield. Now don't pretend not to have a memory, because you and I know better." "David Copperfield?" said Mr. Dick, who did not appear to me to remember much about David Copperfield. Oh, yes, to be sure, David, yes, certainly. "Yes," pursued my aunt, "and he has done a pretty piece of business. He has run away. Now, here you see young David Copperfield, and the question I put to you is, what shall I do with him?" "What shall you do with him?" said Mr. Dick, feebly, scratching his head. Do with him? Yes," said my aunt. "Why, if I was you," said Mr. Dick, considering and looking vacantly at me, I should... The contemplation of me seemed to inspire him with a sudden idea, and he added briskly, "I should wash him." "Janet," said my aunt, turning round with quiet triumph, which I did not then understand, "Mr. Dick sets us all right. Heat the bath." When I had bathed, they, I mean my aunt and Janet, enrobed me in a shirt and a pair of trousers belonging to Mr. Dick, and tied me up in 2 or 3 great shawls. What sort of a bundle I looked like, I don't know. We dined off a roast fowl and a pudding, I sitting at the table, not unlike a trussed bird myself, and moving my arms with considerable difficulty. After dinner, my aunt listened to my story, and when I finished, turned to Mr. Dick. "Now, Mr. Dick," said my aunt, her grave look and her forefinger up, "I am going to ask you a question. Look at this child. What would you do with him now?" Do with David's son?" said Mr. Dick. "Aye," replied my aunt, "with David's son." Said Mr. Dick. Yes, do with... I should put him to bed." "Janet," cried my aunt, with the same complacent triumph that I had remarked before, "Mr. Dick sets us all right. If the bed is ready, we'll take him up to it." On going down in the morning, I found my aunt musing profoundly over the breakfast table with her elbow on the tray. "Hello," said my aunt, after a long time. I looked up and met her sharp, bright glance respectfully. "I have written to him," said my aunt. To your father-in-law," said my aunt. "I have sent him a letter that I'll trouble him to attend to, or he and I will fall out, I can tell him." "Does he know where I am, aunt?" I inquired, alarmed. "I have told him," said my aunt, with a nod. Shall I be given up to him?" I faltered. "I don't know," said my aunt. "We shall see." "Oh, I can't think what I shall do," I exclaimed, "if I have to go back to Mr. Murdstone." "I don't know anything about it," said my aunt, shaking her head. "I can't say, I'm sure. We shall see." My spirits sank under these words, and I became very downcast and heavy of heart. At length the reply from Mr. Murdstone came, and my aunt informed me, to my infinite terror, that he was coming to speak to her herself on the next day. On the following day, Mr. and Miss Murdstone were duly invited into Aunt Betsy's parlour. Mr. Murdstone began. "Miss Trotwood, I am here to take David back, to take him back unconditionally, to dispose of him as I think proper, and to deal with him as I think right. I am not here to make any promise or give any pledge to anybody. You may possibly have some idea, Miss Trotwood, of abetting him in his running away and in his complaints to you. Now, I must caution you that if you abet him once,
You abet him for good and all. If you step in between him and me now, you must step in, Miss Trotwood, forever."
To this address, my aunt had listened with the closest attention, sitting perfectly upright with her hands folded on one knee and looking grimly on the speaker. "And what does the boy say?" said my aunt. "Are you ready to go, David?" I answered no, and entreated her not to let me go. I said that I had been more miserable than I thought anybody could believe who only knew how young I was, and I begged and prayed my aunt to befriend and protect me for my father's sake. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "what shall I do with this child?" Mr. Dick considered, hesitated, brightened, and rejoined, "Have him measured for a suit of clothes directly." "Mr. Dick," said my aunt triumphantly, "give me your hand, for your common sense is invaluable." Having shaken it with great cordiality, she pulled me towards her and said to Mr. Murdstone, "You can go when you like. I'll take my chance with the boy. If he's all you say he is, at least I can do as much for him then as you have done. But I don't believe a word of it." "Miss Trotwood," rejoined Mr. Murdstone, shrugging his shoulders as he rose, "if you were a gentleman—" "Bah! Stuff and nonsense," said my aunt. "Don't talk to me." "How exquisitely polite," exclaimed Miss Murdstone, rising. "Overpowering, really." "Good day, sir," said my aunt, "and goodbye. Good day to you too, ma'am," said my aunt, suddenly turning upon his sister. The manner of the speech, no less than the matter, was so fiery that Miss Murdstone, without a word in answer, discreetly put her arm through her brother's and walked haughtily out of the cottage. When they were gone, my aunt turned triumphantly to Mr. Dick. "You'll consider yourself guardian, jointly with me, of this child, Mr. Dick." "I should be delighted," said Mr. Dick, "to be the guardian of David's son." "Very good," returned my aunt. "That's settled. I have been thinking, do you know, Mr. Dick, that I might call him Trotwood?" Yes, to be sure, yes. Trotwood Copperfield," said Mr. Dick, a little abashed. Thus I began my new life, in a new name, and with everything new about me. In the course of a few weeks, Aunt Betsy shortened my adopted name of Trotwood into Trot. "Trot," said my aunt one evening, when the backgammon board was placed as usual for herself and Mr. Dick, "we must not forget your education." This was my only subject of anxiety, and I felt quite delighted by her referring to it. "Should you like to go to school at Canterbury?" said my aunt. I replied that I should like it very much, as it was so near her. "Good," said my aunt. "Should you like to go tomorrow?" Being already no stranger to the general rapidity of my aunt's evolutions, I was not surprised by the suddenness of the proposal and said yes. "Good," said my aunt again. "Janet, hire the grey pony and chaise tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock and pack up Master Trotwood's clothes tonight." My aunt drove the grey pony through Dover in a masterly manner. When we came into the country road, she asked me whether I was happy. "Very happy indeed. Thank you, Aunt," I said. She was much gratified, and both her hands being occupied, patted me on the head with her whip. "Is it a large school, Aunt?" I asked. "Why, I don't know," said my aunt. "We are going to Mr. Wickfield's first. Does he keep a school?" "No, Trot," said my aunt. "He keeps an office." When the pony chaise stopped at the door, and my eyes were intent upon the house, I saw a cadaverous face appear at a small window on the ground floor and quickly disappear. The low arched door then opened, and the face came out. It belonged to a red-haired person, a youth of 15, as I take it now, but looking much older, whose hair was cropped as close as the closest stubble, who had hardly any eyebrows and no eyelashes, and eyes of a red-brown so unsheltered and unshaded that I remember wondering how he went to sleep. "Is Mr. Wickfield at home, Uriah Heep?" said my aunt. "Mr. Wickfield's at home, ma'am," said Uriah Heep, "if you're pleased to walk in there," pointing with his long hand to the room he meant. We got out, and leaving him to hold the pony, went into a long, low parlour. "Miss Betsy Trotwood," said the gentleman, "pray walk in. I was engaged for a moment, but you'll excuse my being busy. You know my motive. I have but one in life."
Miss Betsy thanked him, and we went into his room, which was furnished as an office with books, papers, tin boxes, and so forth. "Well, Miss Trotwood," said Mr. Wickfield, for I soon found that it was he, and that he was a lawyer and steward of the estates of a rich gentleman of the county. "What wind blows you here? Not an ill wind, I hope." His hair was quite white now, though his eyebrows were still black. He had a very agreeable face, and I thought was handsome. "This is my nephew," said my aunt. "Wasn't aware you had one, Miss Trotwood," said Mr. Wickfield. "I have adopted him," said my aunt, with a wave of her hand, importing that his knowledge and his ignorance were all one to her, "and I have brought him here to put to a school where he may be thoroughly well taught and well treated. Now tell me where that school is, and what it is, and all about it." After a little discussion, he proposed to take my aunt to the school, that she might see it and judge for herself. I awaited their return in Mr. Wickfield's office. At length, much to my relief, my aunt and Mr. Wickfield came back. They were not so successful as I could have wished, for though the advantages of the school were undeniable, my aunt had not approved of any of the boarding houses proposed for me. "It's very unfortunate," said my aunt. "I don't know what to do, Trot." "It does happen, unfortunately," said Mr. Wickfield. "But I'll tell you what you can do, Miss Trotwood." "What's that?" inquired my aunt. "Leave your nephew here for the present. He's a quiet fellow. He won't disturb me at all. It's a capital house for study, as quiet as a monastery and almost as roomy. Leave him here." My aunt evidently liked the offer. So did I. Mr. Wickfield tapped at a door in a corner of the panelled wall, and a girl of about my own age came quickly out and kissed him. This was his little housekeeper, his daughter Agnes, Mr. Wickfield said. When I heard how he said it and saw how he held her hand, I guessed what the one motive of his life was. She had a little basket trifle hanging at her side with keys in it, and she looked as staid and as discreet a housekeeper as the old house could have. My aunt was as happy as I was in the arrangement made for me, and we went down to the drawing-room again, well pleased and gratified. Agnes went back to her governess, and Mr. Wickfield to his office, so we were left to take leave of one another without any restraint. By 5 o'clock, which was Mr. Wickfield's dinner hour, I was ready for my knife and fork. The cloth was only laid for us two, but Agnes was waiting in the drawing-room before dinner, went down with her father, and sat opposite him at table. I doubted whether he could have dined without her. We did not stay there after dinner, but came upstairs into the drawing-room again. Agnes set glasses for her father and a decanter of port wine. I thought he would have missed its usual flavour if it had been put there for him by any other hands. There he sat, taking his wine and taking a good deal of it, for 2 hours, while Agnes played on the piano, worked and talked to him and me. He was, for the most part, gay and cheerful with us, but sometimes his eyes rested on her, and he fell into a brooding state and was silent. She always observed this quickly, I thought, and always roused him with a question or caress. Then he came out of his meditation and drank more wine. Agnes made the tea and presided over it, and the time passed away after it as after dinner until she went to bed, when her father took her in his arms and kissed her, and she, being gone, ordered candles in his office. Then I went to bed too. But in the course of the evening I had rambled down to the door and a little way along the street. As I came back I saw Uriah Heep shutting up the office, and feeling friendly towards everybody, went in and spoke to him, and at parting gave him my hand. But, oh, what a clammy hand his was, as ghostly to the touch as to the sight. I rubbed mine afterwards to warm it and to rub his off. Next morning, after breakfast, I entered on school life again. I went, accompanied by Mr. Wickfield, to the scene of my future studies, a grave building in a courtyard with a learned air about it that seemed very well suited to the stray rooks and jackdaws who came down from the cathedral towers to walk with a clerkly bearing on the grass plot, and was introduced to my new school. I am doubtful whether I was at heart glad or sorry when my school days drew to an end. My aunt and I had held many grave deliberations on the calling to which I should be devoted. For a year or more I had endeavoured to find a satisfactory answer to her oft-repeated question, what would I like to be? But I had no particular liking that I could discover for anything. It has occurred to me, said my aunt one morning, that a little change and a glimpse of life out of doors may be useful in helping you to know your own mind. Suppose you were to go down into the old part of the country again, for instance, and see that out-of-the-way woman with the savagest of names, said my aunt, rubbing her nose, for she could never thoroughly forgive Peggotty for being so called. Of all things in the world, aunt, I should like it best, I replied. In pursuance of my aunt's kind scheme, I was shortly afterwards fitted out with a handsome purse of money and portmanteau, and tenderly dismissed upon my expedition.
I went to Canterbury first, that I might take leave of Agnes and Mr. Wickfield. Agnes was very glad to see me, and told me that the house had not been like itself since I had left it. "I am sure I am not like myself when I am away," said I. "I seem to want my right hand when I miss you. Though that's not saying much, for there's no head in my right hand and no heart. Everyone who knows you consults with you and is guided by you, Agnes." "Everyone who knows me spoils me, I believe," she answered, smiling. "I shall confide in you just the same, Agnes," I said. "I can never grow out of that. Whenever I fall into trouble or fall in love, I shall always tell you, if you'll let me, even when I come to fall in love in earnest." "Why, you have always been in earnest," said Agnes, laughing again. Then suddenly lifting up her eyes to mine and speaking in a different manner, Agnes said, "Trotwood, there's something that I want to ask you, and that I may not have another opportunity of asking for a long time, perhaps. Something I would ask, I think, of no one else. Have you observed any gradual alteration in Papa?" I had observed it, and had often wondered whether she had too. I must have shown as much now in my face, for her eyes were in a moment cast down, and I saw tears in them. "Tell me what it is," she said in a low voice. "I think... Shall I be quite plain, Agnes, liking him so much?" "Yes," she said. I think he does himself no good by the habit that has increased upon him since I first came here. His hand trembles, his speech is not plain, and his eyes look wild. I've remarked that at those times, and when he is least like himself, he is most certain to be wanted on some business." "By Uriah," said Agnes. "Yes, and the sense of being unfit for it, or of not having understood it, or of having shown his condition in spite of himself, seems to make him so uneasy that next day he is worse, and next day worse, and so he becomes jaded and haggard. Do not be alarmed by what I say, Agnes, but in this state I saw him only the other evening lay down his head upon his desk and shed tears like a child." Her hand passed swiftly before my lips while I was yet speaking, and in a moment she had met her father at the door of the room and was hanging on his shoulder. The expression of her face as they both looked towards me I felt to be very touching. Morning brought with it my parting from the old house, which Agnes had filled with her influence. I was heavier at heart when I packed up such of my books and clothes as still remained there to be sent to Dover than I cared to show to Uriah Heep, who was so officious to help me that I uncharitably thought him mighty glad that I was going. I got away from Agnes and her father somehow with an indifferent show of being very manly, and took my seat upon the box of the London coach. When I came to London, I went to the Golden Cross at Charing Cross, then a mouldy sort of establishment in a close neighbourhood. A waiter showed me into the coffee-room. In going towards the door, I passed the person who had come in and saw him plainly. I turned directly, came back and looked again. He did not know me, but I knew him in a moment. "Steerforth, won't you speak to me?" "My God," he suddenly exclaimed, "it's little Copperfield." I grasped him by both hands and could not let them go. But for very shame and the fear that it might displease him, I could have held him round the neck and cried, "I never, never, never was so glad, my dear Steerforth. I'm so overjoyed to see you." I brushed away the tears that my utmost resolution had not been able to keep back, and I made a clumsy laugh of it, and we sat down together side by side. "Why, how do you come to be here?" said Steerforth, clapping me on the shoulder. "I should like to hear what you're doing and where you're going and all about you. I feel as if you were my property." Glowing with pleasure to find that he had still this interest in me, I told him how my aunt had proposed the little expedition that I had before me and whither it tended. "As you're in no hurry, then," said Steerforth, "come home with me to Highgate and stay a day or two. You'll be pleased with my mother. She's a little vain and prosy about me, but that you can forgive her, and she will be pleased with you." "I should like to be as sure of that as you are kind enough to say you are," I answered, smiling. "Good," said Steerforth. "Come and prove it. We'll journey out to Highgate by the coach." It was dusk when the stagecoach stopped with us at an old brick house at Highgate on the summit of the hill. An elderly lady, though not very far advanced in years, was in the doorway as we alighted and greeted Steerforth as "my dearest James," folded him in her arms. To this lady he presented me as his mother, and she gave me a stately welcome. It was a genteel, old-fashioned house, very quiet and orderly. From the windows of my room I saw all London lying in the distance like a great vapour, with here and there some lights twinkling through it. There was a second lady in the dining room of a slight, short figure, dark and not agreeable to look at, but with some appearance of good looks, too, who attracted my attention. Perhaps because I had not expected to see her, perhaps because I found myself sitting opposite to her, perhaps because of something really remarkable in her. She had black hair and eager black eyes, and was thin, and had a scar upon her lip. I concluded in my own mind that she was about 30 years of age, and that she wished to be married. Her thinness seemed to be the effect of some wasting fire within her, which found a vent in her gaunt eyes. She was introduced as Miss Dartle, and both Steerforth and his mother called her Rosa. I found that she lived there and had been for a long time Mrs. Steerforth's companion. It appeared to me that she never said anything she wanted to say outright, but hinted it and made a great deal more of it by this practice. Her own views of every question and her correction of everything that was said to which she was opposed, Miss Dartle insinuated in the same way. I am particular about this woman because she made a particular effect on me at that time, and because of what took place thereafter. The days passed rapidly, as may be supposed, to one entranced, as I was, and gave me so many occasions for knowing Steerforth better and admiring him more in 1,000 respects, that I seemed to have been with him for a much longer time. A dashing way he had of treating me like a plaything was more agreeable to me than any behaviour he could have adopted. Steerforth made up his mind to go with me into the country, and the day arrived for our departure. What I felt in returning so auspiciously to the old familiar place I shall not endeavour to describe. We went down by the mail. I was so concerned, I recollect, even for the honour of Yarmouth, that when Steerforth said, as we drove through its dark streets to the inn, that, as well as he could make out, it was a good, queer, out-of-the-way kind of hole, I was highly pleased. He maintained all his delightful qualities to the last, until we started forth at 8 o'clock for Mr. Peggotty's boat. "Master Davy! It's Master Davy!" cried Ham as he opened the door to us. In a moment we were all shaking hands with one another and asking one another how we did. "If this ain't," said Mr. Peggotty, sitting down among us by the fire, "the brightest night of my life, I'm a shellfish and more I can't say. This here is little Emily, sir," in a low voice to Steerforth. "Her as you see a blushing here just now." Steerforth only nodded, but with such a pleased expression of interest and of participation in Mr. Peggotty's feelings that the latter answered him as if he had spoken. "To be sure," said Mr. Peggotty, "that's her, and so she is. Thank ye, sir." Ham nodded to me several times, as if he would have said so too. "This here little Emily of ours," said Mr. Peggotty, "she ain't my child. I never had one, but I couldn't love her more. You understand, I couldn't do it." "I quite understand," said Steerforth. "There was a certain person as had knowed our Emily," Mr. Peggotty continued, "from the time when her father was drownded, as he had seen her constant, when a babby, when a young girl, when a woman. Not much of a person to look at, he weren't," said Mr. Peggotty. "Something of my own build, rough. A good deal of the sou'wester in him, werry salt, but on the whole, a honest sort of chap with his heart in the right place." I thought I'd never seen Ham grin to anything like the extent to which he sat grinning at us now. "I love her true," said Ham. "There ain't a gentleman in all the land, nor yet sailing upon all the sea, that can love his lady more than I love her, though there's many a common man would say better what he meant." I thought it affecting to see such a sturdy fellow as Ham was now, trembling in the strength of what he felt for the pretty little creature who had won his heart. Emily said little all evening, but she looked and listened, and her face got animated, and she was charming. Steerforth told a story of a dismal shipwreck which arose out of his talk with Mr. Peggotty, as if he saw it all before him, and little Emily's eyes were fastened on him all the time, as if she saw it too. As I remember, it was almost midnight when we took our leave. "A most engaging little beauty," said Steerforth, taking my arm. "How fortunate we are, too," I returned, "to have arrived to witness Ham and Emily's happiness in their intended marriage." "That's rather a truckle-headed fellow for the girl, isn't he?" said Steerforth. He'd been so hearty with him and with them all that I felt a shock in this unexpected and cold reply. Steerforth and I stayed for more than a fortnight in that part of the country. While we were at breakfast on the day of our departure, a letter was delivered to me from my aunt. As it contained matter on which I thought Steerforth could advise me as well as anyone, and on which I knew I should be delighted to consult him, I resolved to make it a subject of discussion on our journey home. What about that letter you were speaking of at breakfast? Asked Steerforth, once our journey was underway. Oh, I said, taking it out of my pocket, it's from my aunt. And what does she say? Why, she reminds me, Steerforth, said I, that I came out on this expedition to look about me and to think a little. Which, of course, you have done. I laughed and replied that I still saw no suitable profession in view. What says our aunt on the subject? Inquired Steerforth. She asks me, said I, if I think I should like to be a proctor. What is a proctor, Steerforth? Why, he's a sort of monkish attorney, replied Steerforth. He is to some faded courts held in Doctors' Commons, a lazy old nook near St. Paul's churchyard, what solicitors are to the courts of law and equity. And so it was that with the aid and advice of dear Aunt Betsy, I entered upon my career at Doctors' Commons in the office of Spenlow and Jorkins. It was a wonderfully fine thing to have a set of chambers in Lincoln's Inn to myself. It was a wonderfully fine thing to walk about town with the key of my house in my pocket and to know that I could ask any fellow to come home and make quite sure of its being inconvenient to nobody if it were not so to me. After 2 days and nights, I felt as if I had lived there for a year, and yet I was not an hour older, but was quite as much tormented by my own youthfulness as ever. I was taking my coffee and roll in the morning before going to the Commons, when Steerforth himself walked in, to my unbounded joy. "My dear Steerforth," cried I, "but you shall have some breakfast." No, said Steerforth, "I can't." "But you'll come back to dinner," said I. "I can't, upon my life. I'm to dine this evening with 3 friends of mine." "Then bring them here to dinner," I returned. "Do you think they would come?" "Oh, sure, they would come fast enough," said Steerforth. And so Steerforth and his companions assembled at my lodgings for dinner. Being a little embarrassed at first and feeling much too young to preside, I made Steerforth take the head of the table and seated myself opposite to him. Everything was very good. I passed the wine faster and faster, and continually started up with a corkscrew to open more wine long before any was needed. I proposed Steerforth's health. I said he was my dearest friend, the protector of my boyhood, and the companion of my prime. I finished by saying, "I'll give you Steerforth. God bless him, hurrah!" And I broke my glass in going round the table to shake hands with him, and I said in 2 words, "Steerforth, you're the guiding star of my existence." Somebody said to me, "Let us go to the theatre, Copperfield." "The theatre, to be sure, the very thing. Come along." Shortly afterwards, we were very high up in a very hot theatre. There was a great stage, and there were people upon it talking about something or the other, but not at all intelligibly. On someone's motion, we resolved to go downstairs to the dress boxes where the ladies were. Then I was being ushered into a box, and found myself saying something as I sat down, and people about me crying "Silence" to somebody, and ladies casting indignant glances at me, and what? Yes, Agnes, sitting on the seat before me in the same box. "Agnes," I said, thickly. "Lord bless me. Agnes." "Hush, pray," she answered. I could not conceive why. "You disturb the company. Look at the stage." I tried, on her injunction, to fix it and to hear something of what was going on there, but quite in vain. "Agnes," I said. Yes. "Do not mind me, Trotwood," she replied. "Listen. Are you going away soon?" "Am I going away soon?" I repeated. "I know you will do as I ask you, if I tell you I am very earnest in it. Go away now, Trotwood, for my sake, and ask your friends to take you home." She had so far improved me, for the time, that though I was angry with her, I felt ashamed, and with the short "Go," which I intended for "good night," got up and went away. I was going out at my door on the morning after a deplorable day of headache, sickness, and repentance, when I saw a ticket porter coming upstairs with a letter in his hand. "T. Copperfield, Esquire," said the ticket porter. I could scarcely lay claim to the name. I was so disturbed by the conviction that the letter came from Agnes. I found, when I did open it, that it was a very kind note containing no reference to my condition at the theatre. All it said was, "My dear Trotwood, I am staying at the house of Papa's agent, Mr. Waterbrook, in Ely Place, Holborn. Will you come and see me today at any time you like to appoint? Ever yours affectionately, Agnes." It took me such a long time to write an answer at all to my satisfaction. After many attempts, I wrote, "My dear Agnes, your letter is like you, and what could I say of it that would be higher praise than that? I will come at 4 o'clock, affectionately and sorrowfully, Trotwood." The professional business of Mr. Waterbrook's establishment was done on the ground floor, and the genteel business, of which there was a good deal, in the upper part of the building. I was shown into a pretty drawing-room, and there sat Agnes. She looked so quiet and good, and reminded me so strongly of my airy, fresh school days at Canterbury, and the sodden, smoky, stupid wretch I had been the other night. If it had been anyone but you, Agnes, said I, turning away my head, I should not have minded it half so much, but that it should have been you who saw me. I almost wish I had been dead first. She put her hand, its touch was like no other hand, upon my arm for a moment. Sit down, said Agnes cheerfully. Don't be unhappy, Trotwood. If you cannot confidently trust me, whom will you trust? Ah, Agnes, I returned, you are my good angel. She smiled rather sadly, I thought, and shook her head. If I were indeed, Trotwood, she returned, there is one thing that I should set my heart on very much, and that is on warning you against your bad angel. My dear Agnes, I began, if you mean Steerforth, I do, Trotwood, she returned. Then, Agnes, you wrong him very much. I do not judge him from what I saw of you the other night, she replied, quietly. From what, then? From many things, trifles in themselves, but they do not seem to me to be so when they are put together. I judge him partly from your account of him, Trotwood, and your character, and the influence he has over you. There was always something in her modest voice that seemed to touch a chord within me. I sat looking at her as she cast her eyes down on her work. I sat seeming still to listen to her, and Steerforth, in spite of all my attachment to him, darkened in that tone. Then she asked me if I had seen Uriah. Uriah Heep, said I. No. Is he in London? He comes to the office downstairs every day, returned Agnes. He was in London a week before me. I am afraid on disagreeable business, Trotwood. I believe he is going to enter into partnership with Papa. What? Uriah? That mean, fawning fellow worm himself into such promotion, I cried indignantly. His ascendancy over Papa, said Agnes, is very great. He professes humility and gratitude, with truth, perhaps, I hope so, but his position is really one of power, and I fear he makes a hard use of his power. I said he was a hound, which, at the moment, was a great satisfaction to me. Agnes had no time to say more, for the room door opened, and Mrs. Waterbrook, who was a large lady, came sailing in and invited me to dinner next day. I accepted the invitation and took my leave. When I went to dinner next day, I found Uriah Heep among the company in a suit of black and in deep humility. He hovered about me, and whenever I said a word to Agnes, was sure, with his shadowless eyes and cadaverous face, to be looking gauntly down upon us from behind. There were other guests, but there was one who attracted my attention before he came in, on account of my hearing him announced as Mr. Traddles. My mind flew back to Salem House, and could it be Tommy, I thought? I looked for Mr. Traddles with unusual interest. He got into an obscure corner so soon that I had some difficulty in making him out. At length I had a good view of him, and either my vision deceived me, or it was the old, unfortunate Tommy. My observation was still in progress when dinner was announced. Traddles and I were separated at table, being billeted in two remote corners. After dinner, I was very glad indeed to get upstairs to Agnes and to talk with her in a corner and to introduce Traddles to her, who was shy but agreeable, and the same good-natured creature still. As he was obliged to leave early, I had not nearly so much conversation with him as I could have wished, but we exchanged addresses and promised ourselves the pleasure of another meeting when he should come back to town. He was greatly interested to hear that I knew Steerforth, and spoke of him with such warmth that I made him tell Agnes what he thought of him. But Agnes only looked at me the while, and very slightly shook her head when only I observed her. I saw no more of Uriah Heep until the day when Agnes left town. I was at the coach office to take leave of her and see her go, and there he was, returning to Canterbury by the same conveyance. At the coach window, as at the dinner party, he hovered about us without a moment's intermission, like a great vulture, gorging himself on every syllable that I said to Agnes or Agnes said to me. I had thought very much of the words Agnes had used in reference to the partnership, and a miserable foreboding that she would yield to and sustain herself by the same feeling in reference to any sacrifice for his sake had oppressed me ever since. I knew how she loved her father. I knew what the devotion of her nature was. I could not get over this farewell glimpse of them for a long time. When Agnes wrote to tell me of her safe arrival, I was as miserable as when I saw her going away. In the meantime, days and weeks slipped away, and I was articled to Spenlow and Jorkins. I had £90 a year from my aunt, and my rooms were engaged for 12 months certain. On the day when I was articled, no festivity took place beyond my having sandwiches and sherry into the office for the clerks. Mr. Spenlow remarked on this occasion that he should have been happy to have seen me at his house at Norwood to celebrate our becoming connected, but for his domestic arrangements being in some disorder on account of the expected return of his daughter from finishing her education at Paris. In a week or two, he referred to this idea and said that if I would do him the favour to come down next Saturday and stay till Monday, he would be extremely happy. On the appointed day, we arrived at his house. "Where is Miss Dora?" said Mr. Spenlow to the servant. Dora, I thought. What a beautiful name. Then I heard a voice say, "Mr. Copperfield, my daughter Dora." It was no doubt Mr. Spenlow's voice, but I didn't know it, and I didn't care whose it was. All was over in a moment. I had fulfilled my destiny. I was a captive slave. I loved Dora Spenlow to distraction. A bell rang, which Mr. Spenlow said was the first dinner bell, and so carried me off to dress. The idea of dressing oneself or doing anything in the way of action in that state of love was a little too ridiculous. The bell rang again so soon that I made a mere scramble of my dressing instead of the careful operation I could have wished under the circumstances, and went downstairs. I don't remember who was there, except Dora. I have not the least idea what we had for dinner, besides Dora. My impression is that I dined off Dora entirely and sent away half a dozen plates untouched. I sat next to her. I talked to her. She had the most delightful little voice, the gayest little laugh, the pleasantest and most fascinating little ways that ever led a youth into hopeless slavery. All I know of the rest of the evening is that I retired to bed in a most maudlin state of mind and got up in a crisis of feeble infatuation. It was a fine morning and early, and I thought I would go and take a stroll down one of those wire-arched walks and indulge my passion by dwelling on her image. I had not been walking long when I turned a corner and met her. I tingle again from head to foot as my recollection turns that corner, and my pen shakes in my hand. "You are out early, Miss Spenlow," said I. "It's the brightest time of the whole day. Don't you think so?" she replied. You have just come home from Paris," said I. "Yes," said she. "Have you ever been there?" "No." "Oh, I hope you'll go soon. You would like it so much." Traces of deep-seated anguish appeared in my countenance. That she should hope I would go, that she should think it possible I could go, was insupportable. I depreciated Paris. I depreciated France. I said I wouldn't leave England under any existing circumstances for any earthly consideration. Nothing should induce me. We had a quiet day. No company, a walk, a family dinner, and an evening of looking over books and pictures. Ah, little did Mr. Spenlow imagine, when he sat opposite to me after dinner that day, how fervently I was embracing him in my fancy as his son-in-law. Little did he think, when I took leave of him at night, that he had just given his full consent to my being engaged to Dora, and that I was invoking blessings on his head. We departed early in the morning, for we had a salvage case coming on in the Admiralty course. Dora was at the breakfast table to make the tea again. However, I had the melancholy pleasure of taking off my hat to her in the carriage as she stood on the doorstep with Jip, her pet dog, in her arms. I was always very miserable afterwards to think that she had no idea of the extent of my devotion. I was always looking out for another invitation to Mr. Spenlow's house. I was always being disappointed, for I got none. It came into my head one day to go and look after Traddles. I found that the street was not as desirable a one as I could have wished it to be for the sake of Traddles. Happening to arrive at the door as it was opened to the afternoon milkman, I found Traddles was on the landing to meet me. He was delighted to see me and gave me welcome with great heartiness to his little room. "I don't make much, but I don't spend much," announced my friend. "In general, I board with the people downstairs, who are very agreeable people indeed. Both Mr. and Mrs. Micawber have seen a great deal of life and are excellent company." "My dear Traddles," I quickly exclaimed, "what are you talking about? Why, I am intimately acquainted with them." An opportune double knock at the door, which I knew well from my old experience in Windsor Terrace, and which nobody but Mr. Micawber could ever have knocked at that door, resolved any doubt in my mind as to their being my old friends. Mr. Micawber slightly bowed to me and pulled up his shirt collar. "How do you do, Mr. Micawber?" said I. "Sure,"
said Mr. Micawber. "You are exceedingly obliging. I am in statu quo."
"And Mrs. Micawber?" I pursued.
"Sir," said Mr. Micawber, "she is also, thank God, in statu quo."
All this time, Mr. Micawber had not known me in the least, but now, seeing me smile, he examined my features with more attention, fell back, cried, and shook me by both hands with the utmost fervour. Mr. Micawber was very anxious that I should stay to dinner. I should not have been averse to do so, but that I imagined I detected trouble, and calculation relative to the extent of the cold meat. I therefore pleaded another engagement. But I told Traddles and Mr. Micawber that before I could think of leaving, they must appoint a day when they would come and dine with me. An appointment was made for the purpose that suited us all, and then I took my leave. On the occasion of this domestic little party, I did not repeat my former extensive preparations. I merely provided a pair of soles, a small leg of mutton, and a pigeon pie. At the appointed time, my 3 visitors arrived together, and they were all delighted with my residence. The evening passed with the elucidation by Mr. Micawber of his latest scheme, in which I feared he had involved my friend Traddles. Towards the end of a most enjoyable evening, I drew my friend Traddles to one side. "Traddles," said I, "Mr. Micawber don't mean any harm, poor fellow, but if I were you, I wouldn't lend him anything." "My dear Copperfield," returned Traddles, smiling, "I haven't got anything to lend." "You have got a name, you know," said I. "Oh, you call that something to lend?" returned Traddles, with a thoughtful look. "Certainly." "Oh," said Traddles, "yes, to be sure, I am very much obliged to you, Copperfield, but I am afraid I have lent him that already." Mr. Micawber looking up at this juncture to where we were all standing, I had only time to repeat my caution. Traddles thanked me and descended, but I was much afraid when I observed the good-natured manner in which he went down with the cap in his hand and gave Mrs. Micawber his arm, that he would be carried into the money market neck and heels. I returned to my fireside and was musing, half gravely and half laughing, on the character of Mr. Micawber and the old relations between us, when I heard a quick step ascending the stairs. As the step approached, I knew it, and felt my heart beat high and the blood rush to my face, for it was Steerforth's. "Why, Daisy, old boy, dumbfounded," laughed Steerforth, shaking my hand heartily and throwing it gaily away. "Have I detected you in another feast, you sybarite?" "I am," said I, "not at all bacchanalian tonight, though I confess to another party of 3. "All of whom I met in the street, talking aloud in your praise," returned Steerforth. "Why, here's a supper for a king," he exclaimed, eyeing the remains of our dinner and taking his seat at the table. "I shall do it justice, for I have come from Yarmouth." "From Yarmouth, Steerforth?" I cried, interested to know all about it. "Have you been there long?" "No," he returned, "an escapade of a week or so." "And how are they all? Of course, little Emily is not married yet." Not yet. No, going to be, I believe, in so many weeks or months or something or the other. I've not seen much of 'em, by the by." He laid down his knife and fork, which he had been using with great diligence, and began feeling in his pockets. "I have a letter for you." "From whom?" "Why, from your old nurse," he returned, taking some papers out of his breast pocket. "Old what's-his-name's in a bad way, and it's about that, I believe." "Barkis, do you mean?" "Yes," he returned. "It's all over with poor Barkis, I'm afraid. Put your hand into the breast pocket of my greatcoat on the chair yonder, and I think you'll find the letter." "Here it is," I cried. It was from Peggotty, something less legible than usual and brief. It informed me of her husband's hopeless state. While I deciphered it, Steerforth continued to eat and drink. "I tell you what, Steerforth," said I, when I had read Peggotty's letter, I think I will go down and see my old nurse. It's not that I can do her any good or render her any real service, but she's so attached to me that my visit will have as much effect on her as if I could do both. You have just come back, and it would be in vain to ask you to go with me." But my request was not in vain, and Steerforth agreed to accompany me to Yarmouth. By the time I reached Peggotty and Barkis, the poor man was mortally sick. What mysterious influence my presence had upon him in that state of his senses I shall not pretend to say, but when he at last began to wander feebly, it is certain he was muttering about driving me to school. "He's coming to himself," said Peggotty. "Barkis, my dear."
"C.P. Barkis,"
he cried, faintly.
"No better woman anywhere."
"Look, here's Master Davy," said Peggotty, for he now opened his eyes. I was on the point of asking him if he knew me when he tried to stretch out his arm and said to me, distinctly, with a pleasant smile, "Barkis is willing." And quietly he lay back and died. It was not difficult for me, on Peggotty's solicitation, to resolve to stay in Yarmouth until after the remains of the poor carrier Barkis should have made their last journey to Blunderston. She had long ago bought, out of her own savings, a little piece of ground in our old churchyard near the grave of her sweet girl, as she always called my mother, and there they were to rest. A dread falls on me here. I fear to approach. I cannot bear to think of what did come upon one memorable night, of what must come again if I go on. It is no worse because I write of it. It is done. Nothing can undo it. My old nurse was to go to London with me next day on the business of Barkis's will. Steerforth and I had parted company, he having business of his own in the town, or so he said to me. We were all to meet in the old boathouse that night. Ham would bring Emily at the usual hour. Mr. Peggotty would be expecting us when the day closed in at the fireside. I was soon within sight of Mr. Peggotty's house and of the light within it shining through the window, and I went in. It looked very comfortable indeed. Mr. Peggotty had smoked his evening pipe, and there were preparations for some supper by and by. The fire was bright, the ashes were thrown up, the locker was ready for little Emily in her old place. In her own old place sat Peggotty once more, looking as if she had never left it. "You're first of the lot, Master Davy," said Mr. Peggotty with a happy face. "Sit ye down, sir. It ain't no use saying welcome to you, but you're welcome, kind and hearty." "Thank you, Mr. Peggotty. I'm sure of that." "Well, Peggotty," said I, giving her a kiss, "and how are you, old woman?" Just then the door opened, and a figure stood motionless on the threshold. It was Ham. The night had turned wet since I came in, for he had a large sou'wester hat on slouched over his face. "Where's Emily?" said Mr. Peggotty. Ham made a motion with his head, as if she were outside, and said to me, "Master Davy, will you come out a minute, see what Emily and me has got to show you?" We went out. As I passed him at the door, I saw, to my astonishment and fright, that he was deadly pale. He pushed me hastily into the open air and closed the door upon us. Only upon us two. "Ham, what's the matter, Master Davy?" Oh, for his broken heart, how dreadfully he wept. "Emily has run away. Oh, Master Davy, think how she's run away, when I pray my good and gracious God to kill her, her that is so dear above all things, sooner than let her come to ruin and disgrace. You're a scholar, and know what's right and best. What am I to say indoors, and how am I ever to break it to him, Master Davy?" I saw the door move, and instinctively tried to hold the latch on the outside to gain a moment's time. It was too late. Mr. Peggotty thrust forth his face, and never could I forget the change that came upon it when he saw us. I remember a great wail and cry, and we all standing in the room, I with the paper in my hand which Ham had given me, Mr. Peggotty with his vest torn open, his hair wild, his face and lips quite white, looking fixedly at me. "Read it, sir," he said, in a low, shivering voice. "Slow, please. I don't know as I can understand." In the midst of the silence of death, I read thus, from a blotted letter. "When you, who love me so much better than I ever have deserved, even when my mind was innocent, see this, I shall be far away. When I leave my dear home, oh, my dear home, in the morning, it will be never to come back unless he brings me back a lady. This will be found at night, many hours after, instead of me. Oh, if you knew how much my heart is torn, if even you that I have wronged so much that never can forgive me, could only know what I suffer. Oh, for mercy's sake, tell Uncle that I never loved him half so dear as now. If he don't bring me back a lady, and I don't pray for my own self, I'll pray for all. My parting love to Uncle, my last tears, and my last thanks for Uncle." That was all. Slowly, at last, Mr. Peggotty moved his eyes from my face as if he were waking from a vision, and cast them round the room. Then he said in a low voice, "Who's the man? I want to know his name." Ham glanced at me, and suddenly I felt a shock that struck me back. I felt Peggotty's arm around my neck, but I could not have moved if the house had been about to fall upon me. "For the Lord's love," said Mr. Peggotty, falling back and putting out his hand as if to keep off what he dreaded, "don't tell me his name's Steerforth."
Master Davy, exclaimed Ham in a broken voice, it ain't no fault of yourn, and I'm far from laying of it on you, but his name is Steerforth, and he's a damn villain. Peggotty said he meant to set out on his travels that night. I asked him where he meant to go. He only answered, I'm a-going, sir, to seek my niece. He said this solemnly, bareheaded. Then, putting on his hat, he went to the door and away. Rarely did that hour of the evening come. Rarely did I wake at night. Rarely did I look up at the moon or stars, or watch the falling rain, or hear the wind. But I thought of his solitary figure toiling on, poor pilgrim, and recalled the words, I'm a-gonna seek her far and wide. If any hurt should come to me, remember that the last words I left for her was, my unchanged love is with my darling child, and I forgive her. All this time I'd gone on loving Dora harder than ever. Her idea was my refuge in disappointment and distress, and made some amends to me even for the loss of my friend. The more I pitied myself, or pitied others, the more I sought for consolation in the image of Dora. And so it came about, in the end, that Mr. Spenlow told me this day week was Dora's birthday, and he would be glad if I could come down and join a little picnic on the occasion. I went out of my senses immediately, became a mere driveller next day, on receipt of a little lace-edged sheet of notepaper, favoured by Papa to remind, and passed the intervening period in a state of dotage. If she would like me to die for her, she had but to say the word, and I was ready. Life without Dora's love was not a thing to have on any terms. I couldn't bear it, and I wouldn't. I had loved her every minute, day and night, since I first saw her. I loved her at that minute to distraction. I should always love her every minute to distraction. Lovers had loved her before, and lovers would love her again, but no lover had ever loved, might, could, would, or should ever love as I loved Dora. Well, well, Dora and I were sitting on the garden seat by and by, quiet enough, and Jip was lying in her lap, winking peacefully at me. I was off my mind. I was in a state of perfect rapture. Dora and I were engaged. I suppose we had some notion that this was to end in marriage. We must have had some, because Dora stipulated that we were never to be married without her papa's consent. But in our youthful ecstasy, I don't think that we really looked before us or behind us, or had any aspiration beyond the ignorant present. We were to keep our secret from Mr. Spenlow, but I'm sure the idea never entered my head then that there was anything dishonourable in that. I wrote to Agnes as soon as Dora and I were engaged. Somehow, as I wrote to Agnes on a fine evening by my open window, and the remembrance of her clear, calm eyes and gentle face came stealing over me, it shed such a peaceful influence upon the hurry and agitation that it soothed me into tears. Of Steerforth I said nothing. I knew how quick she always was to divine the truth, and that she would never be the first to breathe his name. To this letter I received an answer by return of post. As I read it, I seemed to hear Agnes speaking to me. It was like her cordial voice in my ears. What can I say more? Except that from hints and implications, I was able to detect that Uriah Heep's ascendancy over her dear father continued. I determined that at some time I should do all in my power to ease the troubles of my poor Agnes and her father. At this time, there was nothing I could do, and soon more pressing problems were to descend on me. Peggotty had returned to London with me to settle some matters of Barkis's will. One day, when she and I returned to my lodgings, we found my outer door standing open and heard voices inside. We looked at one another without knowing what to make of this and went into the sitting room. What was my amazement to find, of all people upon earth, my aunt there and Mr. Dick. "My dear aunt," cried I. "Why, what an unexpected pleasure." We cordially embraced, and Mr. Dick and I shook hands. "Hello," said my aunt to Peggotty, who quailed before her awful presence. "How are you?" "You remember my aunt, Peggotty?" said I. "For the love of goodness, child," exclaimed my aunt, "don't call the woman by that South Sea Island name. She married and got rid of it." "What's your name now?" said my aunt, as a compromise for the obnoxious appellation. "Barkis, ma'am," said Peggotty, with a curtsy. "Well, that's human," said my aunt. "It sounds less as if you wanted a missionary. How d'ye do, Barkis? I hope you're well." Encouraged by these gracious words and by my aunt's extending hand,
Barkis came forward and took the hand and curtsied her acknowledgments. I knew my aunt sufficiently well to know that she had something of importance on her mind, and that there was far more matter in this arrival than a stranger might have supposed. "Trot," said my aunt, "you needn't go." Barkis, "Trot, have you got to be firm and self-reliant?" "I hope so, aunt." "Then why, my love," said my aunt, looking earnestly at me, "why do you think I find myself in your lodgings tonight?" I shook my head, unable to guess. "Because," said my aunt, "it's all I have. Because I'm ruined, my dear. If the house and every one of us had tumbled out into the river together, I could hardly have received a greater shock. Dick knows it," said my aunt, laying her hand calmly on my shoulder. "I am ruined, my dear Trot. All I have in the world is in this room, except the cottage, and that I have left Janet to let. Barkis, I want to get a bed for this gentleman tonight. To save expense, perhaps you can make up something here for myself. Anything will do. It's only for tonight. We'll talk about this more tomorrow." Whatever was the cause of my aunt's downfall, immediate arrangements had to be made. I took Mr. Dick to find rooms in a nearby inn, while Aunt Betsy and Peggotty, or Barkis, as my aunt insisted on addressing her, set about to make a bed for me in the sitting-room, so that Aunt Betsy should take my room. When I returned, I found that Barkis had retired, and my aunt was pacing the sitting-room, crimping the borders of her nightcap with her fingers. "Ah, mercy upon us," sighed my aunt. "I know all about it, Trot. Barkis and myself had quite a gossip while you were out with Dick. Oh, Trot, Trot. And so you fancy yourself in love, do you?" "Fancy, aunt?" I exclaimed, as red as I could be. "I adore her with my whole soul." "Dora, indeed," returned my aunt. "And not silly?" "Silly, aunt?" I seriously believe it had never once entered my head for a single moment to consider whether she was or not. I resented the idea, of course, but I was in a manner struck by it, as a new one altogether. "Oh, Trot," she said again. Blind, and without knowing why, I felt a vague, unhappy loss or want of something overshadow me like a cloud. "However," said my aunt, "I don't want to put two young creatures out of conceit with themselves or to make them unhappy, so though it is a girl and boy attachment, and girl and boy attachments very often, mind, I don't say always, come to nothing, still we'll be serious about it and hope for a prosperous issue one of these days. There's time enough for it to come to anything." This was not, upon the whole, very comforting to a rapturous lover, but I was glad to have my aunt in my confidence, and I was mindful of her being fatigued, so I thanked her ardently for this mark of her affection, and for all her other kindnesses towards me, and after a tender good night, she took her nightcap into my bedroom. One day, when I went to the Commons as usual, I found Mr. Spenlow in the doorway looking extremely grave and talking to himself. Instead of returning my good morning with his usual affability, he looked at me in a distant, ceremonious manner. Then he produced my last letter to Dora, teeming with expressions of devoted affection. "I believe that is your writing, Mr. Copperfield," said Mr. Spenlow. I was very hot, and the voice I heard was very unlike mine when I said, "It is, sir." "If I am not mistaken," said Mr. Spenlow, as he brought out of his desk a parcel of letters tied round with the dearest bit of blue ribbon, "those are also from your pen, Mr. Copperfield?" I took them with a most desolate sensation. Then I mechanically offered them back to him. "No, thank you," said Mr. Spenlow coldly. "I will not deprive you of them. I beg to ask, Mr. Copperfield, if you have anything to say in reply?" "There is nothing I can say, sir," I returned, "except that all the blame is mine. Dora—" "Miss Spenlow, if you please," said her father majestically. Miss Spenlow was induced and persuaded by me, I went on, swallowing that colder designation, to consent to this concealment, and I bitterly regret it. "You are very much to blame, sir," said Mr. Spenlow. "You have done a stealthy and unbecoming action, Mr. Copperfield. When I take a gentleman to my house, no matter whether he is 19, 29, or 90, I take him there in a spirit of confidence. If he abuses my confidence, he commits a dishonourable action, Mr. Copperfield." "I feel it, sir, I assure you," I returned, "but I never thought so before. Sincerely, honestly, indeed, Mr. Spenlow, I never thought so before. I love Miss Spenlow to that extent."
Pooh! Nonsense, said Mr. Spenlow, reddening. Pray don't tell me to my face that you love my daughter, Mr. Copperfield.
Could I defend my conduct if I did not, sir? I returned with all humility.
Can you defend your conduct if you do, sir? Said Mr. Spenlow, stopping short upon the hearthrug. Have you considered your years and my daughter's years, Mr. Copperfield? Have you considered what it is to undermine the confidence that should subsist between my daughter and myself?
Very little, sir, I'm afraid, I answered, speaking to him as respectfully and sorrowfully as I felt. But pray believe me, I have considered my own worldly position. When I explained it to you, we were already engaged.
I beg, said Mr. Spenlow, that you will not talk to me of engagements, Mr. Copperfield.
Love was above all earthly considerations, and I loved Dora to idolatry, and Dora loved me. I didn't exactly say so. I softened it down as much as I could, but I implied it, and I was resolute upon it.
Very well, Mr. Copperfield, said Mr. Spenlow. I must try my influence with my daughter. In the meantime, confer with Miss Trotwood or with any person with any knowledge of life. Take a week, Mr. Copperfield.
I confided all to my aunt when I got home, and in spite of all she could say to me, went to bed despairing. I got up despairing, and went out despairing. It was Saturday morning, and I went straight to the Commons. The news I received there put me in such a variance of emotion that I could scarce take it in. Mr. Tiffy, the senior clerk, informed me that Mr. Spenlow had died the previous evening. Returning home from dining in town, he had been thrown from his carriage and was found lying dead in the road. The shock of such an event happening so suddenly and happening to one with whom I had been in any respect at variance is easily intelligible to anyone. In the trouble of his state of mind, not exclusively my own, I hope, but known to others, I went down to Norwood that night, and finding from one of the servants, when I made my inquiries at the door, that Dora's companion was there, got my aunt to direct a letter to her, which I wrote. My aunt received a few lines next day in reply, addressed outside to her, within to me. Dora was overcome by grief, and when her friend had asked her should she send her love to me, had only cried, as she was always crying, "Oh, dear papa, oh, poor papa." But she had not said no, and that I made the most of. Two ladies now emerged from their retirement and proposed to take Dora to live at Putney. Dora, clinging to them both and weeping, exclaimed, "Oh, yes, aunts, please take me and Jip to Putney." So they went, very soon after the funeral. How I found time to haunt Putney, I'm sure I don't know, but I contrived, by some means or other, to prowl about the neighbourhood pretty often. But to no avail. I could not see her. My aunt, beginning, I imagine, to be made seriously uncomfortable by my prolonged dejection, made a pretence of being anxious that I should go to Dover, to see that all was working well at the cottage, which was let. It was about this time that I heard from Traddles that Mr. Micawber and his family were now living in Canterbury, and most extraordinarily had found himself in the employ of Uriah Heep. Apparently Mr. Micawber was of a high opinion of Heep, which information troubled me much. I determined to undertake my aunt's commission and then to go on to Canterbury and see for myself the state of things there. I found everything in a satisfactory state at the cottage. Having settled the little business I had to transact there and slept there one night, I walked on to Canterbury early in the morning. Arrived at Mr. Wickfield's house, I found Mr. Micawber plying his pen with great assiduity. He was extremely glad to see me, but a little confused too. He would have conducted me immediately into the presence of Uriah, but I declined. "Do you see much of Mr. Wickfield?" I asked.
"Not much," said Mr. Micawber, slightingly. "Mr. Wickfield is, I dare say, a man of very excellent intentions, but he is, well, in short, he is obsolete."
"I'm afraid his partner seeks to make him so," said I.
"My dear Copperfield," returned Mr. Micawber, after some uneasy evolutions on his stool, "allow me to offer a remark. I am here in a capacity of confidence. I am here in a position of trust. The discussion of some topics, even with Mrs. Micawber herself, is, I am led to consider, incompatible with the functions now devolving on me. I would therefore take the liberty of suggesting that in our friendly intercourse, which I trust will never be disturbed, we draw a line."
though I saw an uneasy change in Mr. Micawber, which sat tightly on him as if his new duties were a misfit. I felt I had no right to be offended. My telling him so appeared to relieve him, and he shook hands with me, and I took my leave of him. There was no one in the quaint old drawing-room, though it presented tokens of Mrs. Heap's whereabouts. Uriah's mother had joined her son in living in the Wickfields' house. I looked into the room still belonging to Agnes and saw her sitting by the fire at a pretty old-fashioned desk she had, writing. My darkening the light made her look up. "Ah, Agnes," said I have missed you so much lately." "Indeed?" she replied. "Whenever I have not had you, Agnes, to advise and approve in the beginning, I have seemed to go wild and to get into all sorts of difficulty. When I have come to you, at last, as I have always done, I have come to peace and happiness. I come home now like a tired traveller and find such a blessed sense of rest. But it must not be to me, Trotwood," returned Agnes with a pleasant smile. "It must be to someone else you should turn." "Dora?" said I. "Assuredly." "Why, I have not mentioned, Agnes," said I, a little embarrassed, "that Dora is rather difficult I would not for the world say to rely upon, because she is the soul of purity and truth, but rather difficult I hardly know how to express it, really, Agnes. She is a timid little thing, and easily disturbed and frightened." "Oh, Trotwood," Agnes remonstrated with a smile. "Just your old headlong way. You might have been in earnest in striving to get on in the world without being so very sudden, with a timid, loving, inexperienced girl. Poor Dora." "What ought I to do, then, Agnes?" I inquired, after looking at the fire a little while. "What would it be right to do?" "I think," said Agnes, "that the honourable course to take would be to write to those two ladies. Don't you think that any secret course is an unworthy one?" "Yes. Yes, if you think so," said I. "I am poorly qualified to judge of such matters," replied Agnes with modest hesitation, "but I certainly feel, in short, I feel that your being secret and clandestine is not being like yourself." I had no longer any doubt on the subject. With a lightened heart, though with a profound sense of the weighty importance of my task, I devoted the whole afternoon to the composition of the draft of this letter, for which great purpose Agnes relinquished her desk to me. But first I went downstairs to see Uriah Heap. I found him in possession of a new, plaster-smelling office built out in the garden. "Uriah," said I, as civilly as I could.
"Master Copperfield," said Uriah, "how grateful I am that you should come to see my humble self."
"To tell the truth," I replied, "it was not you I came to this house to see." He looked at me sideways and said with his hardest grin,
"You mean Agnes?"
"Why, yes, I do," said I. Raising his great hands until they touched his chin, he rubbed them softly and softly chuckled, looking as like a malevolent baboon, I thought, as anything human could look.
"You see," he said, "you're quite a dangerous rival, Master Copperfield. You always was, you know."
"Do you set a watch upon Miss Wickfield, and make her home no home because of me?" said I.
"Oh, Master Copperfield, those are very harsh words," he replied.
"Put my meaning into any words you like," said I. "You know what it is, Uriah, as well as I do."
"Oh, no, you must put it into words," he said. "Oh, no, really, I couldn't myself."
"Do you suppose," said I, constraining myself to be very temperate and quiet with him on account of Agnes, "that I regard Miss Wickfield otherwise than as a very dear sister?"
"Well, Master Copperfield," he replied, "you perceive I am not bound to answer that question. You may not, you know. But then, you see, you may."
Anything to equal the low cunning of his visage, and of his shadowless eyes without the ghost of an eyelash, I never saw. "Come then," said I. "For the sake of Miss Wickfield—"
"My Agnes!" he exclaimed, with a sickly, angular contortion of himself. "Would you be so good as to call her Agnes, Master Copperfield?"
"For the sake of Agnes Wickfield, heaven bless her."
"Thank you for that blessing, Master Copperfield," he interposed.
"I will tell you what I should under any circumstances. I am engaged to another young lady. I hope that contents you."
"Upon your soul?"
said Uriah. He was squeezing my hand with his damp, fishy fingers, while I made every effort I decently could to get it away. "Before we leave the subject, you ought to understand," said I, breaking a pretty long silence, "that I believe Agnes Wickfield to be far above you and as far removed from all your aspirations as the moon herself."
Peaceful, ain't she? Said Uriah. Very. Now confess, Master Copperfield, that you haven't liked me quite as I have liked you. All along you've thought me too humble now, I shouldn't wonder.
"I am not fond of professions of humility," I returned, "or professions of anything else." This led to his withdrawing his hand in order that he might have another hug of himself under the chin. Once apart from him, I was determined to keep apart, and immediately left him. There was nothing I could do to ease the situation in that house, and it was with a heavy heart that next morning I returned to London. At last an answer came from Dora's aunts. They presented their compliments to Mr. Copperfield and informed him that they had given his letter their best consideration with a view to the happiness of both parties, and if Mr. Copperfield would do them the favour to call upon a certain day, they would be happy to hold some conversation on the subject. Let me pause upon a memorable period of my life. Let me stand aside to see the phantoms of those days go by me, accompanying the shadow of myself in dim procession. Weeks, months, seasons pass along. They seem little more than a summer day and a winter evening. I have come legally to man's estate. I have attained the dignity of 21. But this is a sort of dignity that may be thrust upon one. Let me think what I have achieved. I have taken with fear and trembling to authorship. I wrote a little something in secret and sent it to a magazine, and it was published in the magazine. Since then, I have taken heart to write a novel. We have removed to a pleasant little cottage. My aunt, however, is not going to remain here, but intends removing herself to a still more tiny cottage close at hand. What does this portend? My marriage? Yes. Yes, I am going to be married to Dora. Miss Lavinia and Miss Clarissa, Dora's aunts, have given their consent, and if ever canary birds were in a flutter, they are. The church is calm enough, I'm sure, but it might be a steam power loom in full action for any sedative effect it has on me. I am too far gone for that. The rest is all a more or less incoherent dream. Of the clergyman and clerk appearing, of little Dora trembling very much and making her responses in faint whispers, of her waving her little hand and our going away once more, of her once more stopping and looking back and hurrying to Agnes and giving Agnes, above all the others, her last kisses and farewells. We drive away together, and I awake from the dream. I believe it at last. It is my dear, dear little wife beside me, whom I love so well. "Are you happy now, you foolish boy?" says Dora, "and sure you don't repent?" I have stood aside to see the phantoms of those days go by me. They are gone, and I resume the journey of my story. It was a strange condition of things when I found myself sitting down in my own small house with Dora. It seemed such an extraordinary thing to have Dora always there. Sometimes of an evening, when I looked up from my writing and saw her seated opposite, I would lean back in my chair and think how queer it was that there we were, alone together as a matter of course, nobody's business any more, all the romance of our engagement put away upon a shelf to rust, no one to please but one another to please for life. I laboured hard at my book, and it came out and was very successful. I was not stunned by the praise which sounded in my ears, notwithstanding that I was keenly alive to it, and thought better of my own performance, I have little doubt, than anybody else did. Sometimes the speculation came into my thoughts, what might have happened, or what would have happened, if Dora and I had never known each other. I always loved her. What I am describing slumbered and half awoke and slept again in the innermost recesses of my mind. There was no evidence of it in me. I know of no influence it had in anything I said or did. I bore the weight of all our little cares and all my projects. Dora held the pens, and we both felt that our shares were adjusted as the case required. She was truly fond of me and proud of me, and when Agnes wrote a few earnest words in her letters to Dora of the pride and interest with which my old friends heard of my growing reputation and read my book as if they heard me speaking its contents, Dora read them out to me with tears of joy in her bright eyes, and said I was a dear old, clever, famous boy. But as that year wore on, Dora was not strong. I began to carry her downstairs every morning and upstairs every night. She would clasp me round the neck and laugh the while, as if I did it for a wager. Jip would bark and caper around us and go on before and look back on the landing, breathing short to see that we were coming. My aunt, the best and most cheerful of nurses, would trudge after us, a moving mass of shawls and pillows. Mr. Dick would not have relinquished his post of candle-bearer to anyone alive. Traddles would be often at the bottom of the staircase, looking on and taking charge of sportive messages from Dora. We made quite a gay procession of it, as my child wife was the gayest there. But sometimes, when I took her up and felt that she was lighter in my arms, a dead, blank feeling came upon me, as if I were approaching to some frozen region yet unseen that numbed my life. I received one morning by post a letter from Mr. Micawber, dated Canterbury, and addressed to me at Doctors' Commons, which I read with some surprise. I read the letter over several times. Making due allowance for Mr. Micawber's lofty style of composition, I still believed that something important lay hidden at the bottom of his roundabout communication. I was still pursuing it when Traddles found me in the height of my perplexity. "My dear fellow," said I never was better pleased to see you. You come to give me the benefit of your sober judgment at a most opportune time. I have received a very singular letter, Traddles, from Mr. Micawber." "No," cried Traddles, "you don't say so. And I have received one from Mrs. Micawber," which he promptly handed to me. "What do you think of that letter?" said Traddles, casting his eyes upon me when I had read it twice. "What do you think of the other?" said I. "I think that the two together, Copperfield," replied Traddles, "mean more than Mr. and Mrs. Micawber usually mean in their correspondence, but I don't know what. They are both written in good faith, I have no doubt, and without any collusion. It will be a charity to write to both and say that we will not fail to see Mr. Micawber." We all met in due course at my aunt's house, rather than mine, because of Dora's not being well. "I hope Mrs. Micawber and your family are well, sir," said my aunt, when we were all assembled. Mr. Micawber inclined his head. "They are as well, ma'am," he desperately observed after a pause, "as aliens and outcasts can ever hope to be." "Lord bless you, sir," exclaimed my aunt in her abrupt way. "What are you talking about?" "The subsistence of my family, ma'am," returned Mr. Micawber, "trembles in the balance. My employer—" Here Mr. Micawber provokingly left off. I saw that a crisis was at hand, and it came. He rose from his chair, pulled out his pocket-handkerchief, and burst into tears. "Mr. Micawber," said I, "what is the matter? Pray speak out. You are among friends." "Among friends, sir," repeated Mr. Micawber, and all he had reserved came breaking out of him. "Good heavens! It is principally because I am among friends that my state of mind is what it is." My aunt clapped her hands, and we all started up as if we were possessed. "The struggle is over," said Mr. Micawber, violently gesticulating with his pocket-handkerchief and fairly striking out from time to time with both arms as if he were swimming under superhuman difficulties. "I will lead this life no longer. I am a wretched being, cut off from everything that makes life tolerable. I have been under a taboo in that infernal scoundrel's service. Give me back my wife. Give me back my family. Substitute Micawber for the petty wretch who walks about in the boots at present on my feet, and call upon me to swallow a sword tomorrow, and I'll do it with an appetite." I never saw a man so hot in my life. I tried to calm him that we might come to something rational, but he got hotter and wouldn't hear a word. "I'll put my hand in no man's hand," said Mr. Micawber, gasping, puffing and sobbing to that degree that he was like a man fighting with cold water, "until I have blown to fragments the detestable serpent
Heap! I'll partake of no one's hospitality until I have moved Mount Vesuvius to eruption on the abandoned rascal Heap. I'll know nobody and say nothing and live nowhere until I have crushed to undiscoverable atoms the transcendent and immortal hypocrite and perjurer Heap.
I really had some fear of Mr. Micawber's dying on the spot. I would have gone to his assistance, but he waved me off and wouldn't hear a word.
No, Copperfield, no communication until Miss Wickfield redress from wrongs inflicted by consummate scoundrel Heap.
I'm quite convinced that he could not have uttered 3 words, but for the amazing energy with which this word inspired him when he felt it coming.
Inviolable secret from the whole world, no exception. To stay weak. At breakfast time, everybody present, including Aunt, to be at hotel in Canterbury, where Mrs. Micawber and myself, old lang syne in chorus, and will expose intolerable ruffian Heap. No more to say or listen to persuasion, not capable. Bear society upon the track of devoted and doomed traitor Heap.
With this last repetition of the magic word that had kept him going at all, and in which he surpassed all his previous efforts, Mr. Micawber rushed out of the house, leaving us in a state of excitement, hope, and wonder that reduced us to a condition little better than his own. Now I must speak of Mr. Peggotty and his unrelenting search for his niece Emily. He had been a man of sturdy action all his life, and he knew that in all things wherein he wanted help, he must do his own part faithfully and help himself. He made his way by sea to Naples and back. All his journeys were ruggedly performed, for he was always steadfast in a purpose of saving money for Emily's sake when she should be found. In all this long pursuit, I never heard him repine. I never heard him say he was fatigued or out of heart. Now he had received information from a woman, Martha, that led us one dark night to Golden Square. We alighted at one of the entrances to the square where I directed the coach to wait. She laid her hand on my arm and hurried me on to one of the sombre streets. The houses had long degenerated into poor lodgings let off in rooms. Entering at the open door of one of these and releasing my arm, she beckoned me to follow her up the common staircase. As we turned to ascend the last flight of stairs between us and the roof, we caught a full view of a figure pausing for a moment at a door. Then it turned the handle and went in. "What's this?" said Martha in a whisper. "She has gone into my room. I don't know her." I knew her. I had recognized her with amazement. Miss Dartle, Steerforth's cousin. We stopped, breathless with our ascent. I could only see of the room beyond that it was pretty large, that there was a bed in it. I could not see Miss Dartle or the person whom we heard her address. "I have come to see," said Rosa Dartle, "James Steerforth's Fancy, the girl who ran away with him and is the town talk of the commonest people of her native place, the bold, flaunting, practised companion of persons like James Steerforth. I want to know what such a thing is like." "Oh, for heaven's sake, spare me," exclaimed Emily. "Whoever you are, for heaven's sake, spare me, if you would be spared yourself." "If I would be spared," returned the other fiercely, "what is there in common between us, do you think?" "Nothing but our sex," said Emily, with a burst of tears. "And that," said Rosa Dartle, "is so strong a claim preferred by one so infamous, that if I had any feeling in my breast but scorn and abhorrence of you, it would freeze it up. Our sex. You are an honor to our sex." "I have deserved this," said Emily, "but it's dreadful. Dear, dear lady, think what I have suffered and how I am fallen." Miss Dartle placed herself in a chair within view of the door and looked downward as if Emily were crouching on the floor before her. Being now between me and the light, I could see her curled lip and her cruel eyes intently fixed on one place with a greedy triumph. I heard a distant foot upon the stairs. I knew it, I was certain. It was Mr. Peggotty, thank God. The foot upon the stairs came nearer, nearer, and rushed into the room. "Uncle!" cried Emily. A fearful cry followed the word. I paused a moment and, looking in, saw him supporting her insensible figure in his arms. He gazed for a few seconds on the face, then stopped to kiss it. Oh, how tenderly. "I thank my heavenly Father as my dreams come true," he said, in a low, tremulous voice. "I thank him hearty for having guided of me in his own ways to my darling." With those words he took her up in his arms and carried her, motionless and unconscious, down the stairs. It was yet early in the morning of the following day when, as I was walking in my garden with my aunt, I was told that Mr. Peggotty desired to speak with me. "I'll go in now, Trot," said my aunt, "and look after Dora, who will be getting up presently." "Not along of my being here, ma'am, I hope," said Mr. Peggotty as he entered. "You have something to say, my good friend," returned my aunt, "and will do better without me." "By your leave, ma'am," returned Mr. Peggotty, "I should take it kind if you'd bide here." "Would you?" said my aunt, with short good nature. "Then I'm sure I will." So she drew her arm through Mr. Peggotty's and walked with him to a leafy little summer house there was at the bottom of the garden, where she sat down on a bench, and I beside her. "You have quite made up your mind," said I to Mr. Peggotty, "as to the future, good friend?" "Quite, Master Davy," he returned, "and told Emily, there's mighty countries far from here. Our future life lies over the sea." "They will emigrate together, aunt," said I. "Yes," said Mr. Peggotty with a hopeful smile. "No one can't reproach my darling in Australia. We will begin a new life over there." I asked him if he yet proposed to himself any time for going away. "I was down at the docks early this morning, sir," he returned, "to get information concerning them ships. In about 6 weeks or 2 months from now there'll be one sailing. I see her this morning, went abroad, and we shall take our passage in her." "Quite alone?" I asked. "Aye, Master Davy," he returned. "My sister, you see, she's that fond of you and yourn, and that accustomed to think only of her own country, that it wouldn't be hardly fair to let her go. Besides which, there's one she has in charge, Master Davy, as she doesn't oughter forget." "Poor Ham," said I softly. With which, after a moment's silence, we all shook hands and bid Mr. Peggotty good day. When the time Mr. Micawber had appointed so mysteriously was within 24 hours of being come, we four, that is to say, my aunt, Mr. Dick, Traddles, and I, went down to Canterbury by the Dover mail. We found Mr. Micawber at his desk, in the turret office on the ground floor, either writing or pretending to write, hard. As it appeared to me that I was expected to speak, I said aloud, "How do you do, Mr. Micawber?" "Mr. Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber gravely, "I hope I see you well." "Is Miss Wickfield at home?" said I. "Mr. Wickfield is unwell in bed, sir, of a rheumatic fever," he returned, "but Miss Wickfield, I have no doubt, will be happy to see old friends. Will you walk in, sir?" He preceded us to the dining-room, and flinging open the door of Mr. Wickfield's former office, said in a sonorous voice, "Miss Trotwood, Mr. David Copperfield, Mr. Thomas Traddles, and Mr. Dickson." Uriah Heep looked up, astonished. "Well, I'm sure," said he, "this is indeed an unexpected pleasure. To have, as I may say, all friends round St. Paul's at once is a treat unlooked for. Mr. Copperfield, I hope I see you well." I felt ashamed to let him take my hand, but I did not know yet what else to do. "Things are changed in this office, Miss Trotwood, since I was a numble clerk, ain't they?" said Uriah, with his sickliest smile. "But I am not changed, Miss Trotwood." "Well, sir," returned my aunt, "to tell you the truth, I think you are pretty constant to the promise of your youth, if that's any satisfaction to you." "Thank you, Miss Trotwood," said Uriah, writhing in his ungainly manner, "for your good opinion. Micawber, tell 'em to let Miss Agnes know, and Mother. Mother will be quite in a state when she sees the present company," said Uriah, setting chairs. Mr. Micawber retired, and presently returned with Agnes. I saw Uriah watch her while she greeted us, and he reminded me of an ugly and rebellious genie watching a good spirit. In the meantime, some slight sign passed between Mr. Micawber and Traddles, unobserved except by me, went out.
"Don't wait, Micawber," said Uriah.
Mr. Micawber stood erect before the door, most unmistakably contemplating one of his fellow men, and that man his employer.
"What are you waiting for?" said Uriah. "Micawber, did you hear me tell you not to wait?"
"Yes," replied the immovable Mr. Micawber.
"Then why do you wait?"
said Uriah.
"Because in short, choose,"
replied Mr. Micawber with a burst. Uriah's cheeks lost colour, and an unwholesome paleness, still faintly tinged by his pervading red, overspread them. He looked at Mr. Micawber attentively, with his whole face breathing short and quick in every feature.
"You are a dissipated fellow, as all the world knows," he said, with an effort at a smile, "and I'm afraid you'll oblige me to get rid of you. Go along. I'll talk to you presently."
"If there is a scoundrel on this earth," said Mr. Micawber, suddenly breaking out again with the utmost vehemence, "with whom I have already talked too much, that scoundrel's name is Heap." Uriah fell back, as if he had been struck or stung. Looking slowly round upon us with the darkest and wickedest expression that his face could wear, he said, in a lower voice,
"Oh, this is a conspiracy. You have met here by appointment. You are playing booty with my clerk, are you, Copperfield? Now take care. You will make nothing of this."
"Mr. Micawber," says I, "there is a sudden change in this fellow in more respects than the extraordinary one of his speaking the truth in one particular, which assures me that he is brought to bay. Deal with him as he deserves."
"You are a precious set of people, ain't you?"
said Uriah in the same low voice.
"To buy over my clerk, who is that very scum of society, as you yourself were, Copperfield. You know it, before anyone had charity on you, to defame me with his lies. Where's Mother?"
he said, suddenly appearing to notice with alarm the absence of Traddles, and pulling down the bell rope.
"Fine doings in a person's own house."
"Mrs. Heap is here, sir," said Traddles, returning with that worthy mother of a worthy son. "I have taken the liberty of making myself known to her."
"Who are you to make yourself known?" retorted Uriah. "And what do you want here?"
"I am the agent and friend of Mr. Wickfield, sir," said Traddles, in a composed and businesslike way, "and I have a power of attorney from him in my pocket to act for him in all matters."
"The old ass has drunk himself into a state of dotage," said Uriah, turning uglier than before, "and it has been got from him by fraud."
"Something has been got from him by fraud, I know," returned Traddles quietly, "and so do you, Mr. Heap. We will refer that question, if you please, to Mr. Micawber."
"Uri!"
Mrs. Heap began, with an anxious gesture.
"You hold your tongue, Mother," he returned. "Least said, soonest mended. But my Uri! Will you hold your tongue, Mother, and leave it to me? Very well. We shall see, Mr. What's your name? You were going to refer some question to Micawber. There's your referee. Why don't you make him speak? He has learnt his lesson, I see."
Mr. Micawber, whose impetuosity I had restrained thus far with the greatest difficulty, produced from his pocket a foolscap document folded in the form of a large letter, and began to read as follows. "Dear Miss Trotwood and gentlemen, in appearing before you to denounce probably the most consummate villain that has ever existed, I ask no consideration for myself. In an accumulation of ignominy, want, despair, and madness, I entered the office of the firm, nominally conducted under the appellation of Wickfield and Heap, but in reality wielded by Heap alone. Heap, and only Heap, is the mainspring of that machine. Heap, and only Heap, is the forger and the cheat. Heap has, on several occasions, to the best of my knowledge, information, and belief, systematically forged to various entries, books, and documents the signature
of Mr. W., and has distinctly done so in one instance capable of proof by me, to wit, in manner following. That is to say, I have in my possession, in his hand and pocket-book, several similar imitations of Mr. W.'s signature, here and there defaced by fire, but legible to anyone.
Uriah Heep, with a start, took out of his pocket a bunch of keys and opened a certain drawer, then suddenly bethought himself of what he was about and turned again towards us without looking in it.
"And I have the document,"
Mr. Micawber read again, looking about it as if it were the text of a sermon,
"in my possession. That is to say, I had early this morning when this was written, but have since relinquished it to Mr. Traddles."
"It is quite true," assented Traddles.
"Uri, Uri," cried the mother, "be humble and make terms. I know my son will be humble, gentlemen, if you'll give him time to think. Mr. Copperfield, I'm sure you know that he was always very humble, sir."
It was singular to see how the mother still held to the old trick when the son had abandoned it as useless.
"Mother," he said, with an impatient bite at the handkerchief in which his hand was wrapped, "you had better take and fire a loaded gun at me."
"But I love you, Uri," cried Mrs. Heep. And I have no doubt she did, or that he loved her, however strange it may appear, though, to be sure, they were a congenial couple.
"And I can't bear to hear you provoking the gentleman and endangering of yourself more. I told the gentleman at first, when he told me upstairs it was come to light, that I would answer for your being humble and making amends. Oh, see how humble I am, gentlemen, and don't mind him."
"Why, there's Copperfield, mother," he angrily retorted, pointing his lean finger at me, against whom all his animosity was levelled as the prime mover in the discovery, and I did not undeceive him.
"There's Copperfield would have given you £100 to say less than you've blurted out." "I can't help it, Uri," cried his mother. "I can't see you running into danger through carrying your head so high. Better be humble, as you always was."
He remained for a little, biting the handkerchief, and then said to me with a scowl,
"What more have you got to bring forward? If anything, go on with it. What do you look at me for?"
"What must be done," said Traddles, "is this. First, the deed of relinquishment between yourself and Mr. Wickfield must be given over to me now, here."
"Suppose I haven't got it?"
he interrupted. "But you have," said Traddles. "Therefore, you know, we won't suppose so." And I cannot help avowing that this was the first occasion on which I really did justice to the clear head and the plain, patient, practical good sense of my old schoolfellow. "Then," said Traddles, "you must prepare to disgorge all that your rapacity has become possessed of and to make restoration to the last farthing. All the partnership books and papers must remain in our possession, all your books and papers, all money accounts and securities of both kinds. In short, everything here."
"I won't do it,"
said Uriah with an oath. "Maidstone jail is a safe place of detention," observed Traddles. "Copperfield, will you go round to the Guildhall and bring a couple of officers?" Here Mrs. Heep broke out again, crying on her knees to Agnes to interfere in their behalf.
"Stop!" Uriah growled. "Mother, hold your noise. Well, let 'em have that deed. Go and fetch it."
"Good," said Traddles when this was brought. "Now, Mr. Heep, you can retire to think." Uriah, without lifting his eyes from the ground, shuffled across the room with his hand to his chin, and pausing at the door said,
"Copperfield, I've always hated you. You've always been an upstart, and you've always been against me."
"As I think I told you once before," said I, "it is you who have been, in your greed and cunning, against all the world. It may be profitable to you to reflect in future that there never were greed and cunning in the world yet that did not do too much and overreach themselves. It is as certain as death." And so Heep slunk away. The remainder of the day was spent reordering Mr. Wickfield's affairs. Only one of our company was not wholly satisfied with the day's works. Mr. Micawber again found himself without employer. "Mr. Micawber," proposed my aunt, "I wonder you have never turned your thoughts to emigration."
"Madam," returned Mr. Micawber, "it was the dream of my youth and the fallacious aspiration of my riper years.
I am thoroughly persuaded that he had never thought of it in his life. "Aye," said my aunt, with a glance at me. "Why, what a thing it would be for yourselves and your family, Mr. and Mrs. Micawber, if you were to emigrate now."
"Capital, madam, capital,"
urged Mr. Micawber gloomily. "That is the principal, I may say the only difficulty, my dear Mr. Copperfield," assented his wife. "Capital?" cried my aunt. "But you are doing us a great service, have done us a great service, I may say, for surely much will come out of the fire. And what could we do for you that would be half so good as to find the capital? Here are some people David knows going out to Australia shortly. If you decide to go, why shouldn't you go in the same ship? You may help each other." And so it was arranged. I must pause yet once again. Oh, my child wife, there is a figure in the moving crowd before my memory, quiet and still, saying in its innocent love and childish beauty, "Stop to think of me." It is night, and I am with Dora. Agnes has arrived, has been among us for a whole day and an evening. She, my aunt and I have sat with Dora since the morning all together. But now I am alone with Dora, who lies white in her bed. Oh, how my poor boy cries. Hush, hush. Now make me one promise. I want to speak to Agnes. When you go downstairs, tell Agnes so and send her up to me. And while I speak to her, let no one come, not even Aunt. I want to speak to Agnes by herself. I want to speak to Agnes, quite alone. I promise that she shall, immediately. Agnes is downstairs when I go into the parlour, and I give her the message. She disappears, leaving me alone with Jip. I sit down by the fire, thinking with a blind remorse of all those secret feelings I have nourished since my marriage. I think of every little trifle between me and Dora, and feel the truth that trifles make the sum of life. Agnes returns to me, her face quiet and her eyes downcast. "Agnes," I whisper, but she does not speak, only quietly takes my hand. It is over. Darkness comes before my eyes, and for a time, all things are blotted out of my remembrance. In all that sorrow, Agnes was like a sacred presence in my lonely house. When the angel of death alighted there, my child wife fell asleep. They told me so when I could bear to hear it, on her bosom, with a smile. I was to go abroad. That seemed to have been determined among us from the first. The ground now covering all that could perish of my departed wife, I waited only for the departure of the emigrants. I now approach an event in my life so indelible, so awful, so bound by an infinite variety of ties to all that had preceded it in these pages, that from the beginning of my narrative I have seen it growing larger and larger as I advanced, like a great tower in a plain, and throwing its forecast shadow even on the incidents of my childish days. The time drawing on rapidly for the sailing of the emigrant ship, my good old nurse came up to London. I was constantly with her and her brother and the Micawbers, they being very much together, but Emily I never saw. Mr. Peggotty came to visit me one morning, carrying a letter. "Master Davy," he said, when we had shaken hands, "Emily has writ this letter here, and begged me for to ask you to read it, and if you see no hurt in, to be so kind as to take charge on." "Have you read it?" said I. He nodded sorrowfully. I opened it and read. When I had finished reading, I found my eyes full of tears. "May I tell her as you don't see no hurt in't, and as you be so kind as to take charge on, Master Davy?" said Mr. Peggotty. "Unquestionably," said I, "but I'm thinking—" "Yes, Master Davy?" "I'm thinking," said I, "that I'll go down again to Yarmouth and deliver it myself." When I arrived in Yarmouth, a raging storm battered the town. I'd hardly found lodgings at an inn when someone was knocking and calling at my door. "What is the matter?" I cried. "A wreck! Close by!" I sprang out of bed and asked, "What wreck?" But the excited voice went clamouring along the staircase, and I wrapped myself in my clothes as quickly as I could and ran into the street. Numbers of people were there before me, all running in one direction, to the beach. I ran the same way, outstripping a good many, and soon came facing the wild sea. In the difficulty of hearing anything but wind and waves, and in the crowd, I was so confused that I looked out to sea for the wreck and saw nothing but the foaming heads of the great waves. A half-dressed boatman standing next to me pointed with his bare arm to the left. Then, oh, great heaven, I saw it close in upon us. 2 men were seen on board. The agony on the shore increased. Men groaned and clasped their hands. Women shrieked and turned away their faces. Then I noticed that some new sensation moved the people on the beach, and saw them part, and Ham come breaking through them to the front. "Master Davy," he said, cheerily grasping me by both hands, "if my time is come, 'tis come. If 'tain't, I'll bide it. Lord above bless you and bless all. Mates, make ready, I'm a-going off." Ham watched the sea until there was a great retiring wave, when, with a backward glance at those who held the rope which was made fast round his body, he dashed in after it, and in a moment was buffeting with the water. At length he neared the wreck. He was so near that with one more of his vigorous strokes he would be clinging to it, when a high, green, vast hillside of water, moving on shoreward from beyond the ship, he seemed to leap up into it with a mighty bound, and the ship was gone. Some eddying fragments I saw in the sea, as if a mere cask had been broken in running to the spot where they were hauling in. Consternation was in every face. They drew him to my very feet, insensible, dead. As I stood beside his body, a fisherman who had known me when Emily and I were children whispered my name. "Sir," he said, with tears starting to his weather-beaten face, which with his trembling lips was ashy pale, "will you come over yonder?" The old remembrance that had been called to me was in his look. I asked him, terror-stricken, leaning on the arm he held out to support me, "Has a body come ashore?" He said, "Yes." "Do I know it?" I asked then. He answered nothing. But he led me to the shore. I saw him lying with his head upon his arm, as I had often seen him lie at school. My friend, Steerforth. One thing I had to do was to conceal what had occurred from those who were going away, and to dismiss them on their voyage in happy ignorance. In this no time was to be lost. I took Mr. Micawber aside, and confided to him the task of standing between Mr. Peggotty and intelligence of the late catastrophe. He zealously undertook to do so, and to intercept any newspaper through which it might, without such precautions, reach him. "If it penetrates to him, sir," said Mr. Micawber, striking himself on the breast, "it shall first pass through this body." The time was come. I embraced him and hurried away. As the sails rose to the wind and the ship began to move, there broke from all the boats 3 resounding cheers. My heart burst out when I heard the sound, and beheld the waving of the hats and handkerchiefs. And then I saw her, at her uncle's side and trembling on his shoulder. Mr. Peggotty pointed with an eager hand, and she saw and waved her last goodbye to me. I, Emily, beautiful and drooping, cling to him with the utmost trust of thy bruised heart, for he has clung to thee with all the might of his great love. It was a long and gloomy night that gathered on me, haunted by the ghosts of many hopes, of many dear remembrances, many errors, many unavailing sorrows and regrets. I went away from England, not knowing even then how great the shock was that I had to bear. I left all who were dear to me and went away. I landed in London on a wintry autumn evening. It was dark and raining, and I saw more fog and mud in a minute than I had seen in a year. For some changes in the fortunes of my friends, I was prepared. My aunt had long been re-established at Dover, and Traddles had begun to get into some little practice at the bar in the very first term after my departure. I burst safe and sound into my aunt's old parlour while she was at tea, and was received by her and Mr. Dick and dear old Peggotty, who acted as housekeeper, with open arms and tears of joy. My aunt and I, when we were left alone, talked far into the night, how the emigrants never wrote home otherwise than cheerfully and hopefully. "And when, Trot," said my aunt, "when are you going over to Canterbury?" "I shall get a horse and ride over tomorrow morning, aunt, unless you will go with me." "No, no," said my aunt in her short, abrupt way. "I mean to stay where I am." "Then I should ride," I said. I could not have come through Canterbury today without stopping if I had been coming to anyone but her. She was pleased, but answered, "Tut, Trot, my old bones would have kept till tomorrow," and softly patted my hand again as I sat looking thoughtfully at the fire. "You will find her," pursued my aunt, "as good, as beautiful, as earnest, as disinterested as she has always been. If I knew higher praise, Trot, I would bestow it on her. Has Agnes any—" I was thinking aloud rather than speaking. "Well, hey? Any what?" said my aunt sharply. "Any lover?" said I. "A score," cried my aunt with a kind of indignant pride. "She might have got married 20 times, my dear, since you have been gone." "No doubt," said I, "no doubt. But has she any lover who is worthy of her? Agnes could care for no other." My aunt withdrew her eyes from mine as slowly as she had turned them upon me, and covered them thoughtfully with her hand. By and by she put her other hand on my shoulder, and so we both sat, looking into the past without saying another word, until we parted for the night. I rode away early in the morning. The well-remembered ground was soon traversed, and I came into the quiet streets where every stone was a boy's book to me. I requested the new maid who admitted me to tell Miss Wickfield that a gentleman who waited on her from a friend abroad was there. The opening of the little door in the panelled wall made me start and turn. Her beautiful, serene eyes met mine as she came towards me. She stopped and laid her hand upon her bosom, and I caught her in my arms. "Agnes, my dear girl, I have come too suddenly upon you." "No, no, I am so rejoiced to see you, Trotwood." "Dear Agnes, the happiness it is to me to see you once again." I folded her to my heart, and for a little while we were both silent. Presently we sat down side by side, and her angel face was turned upon me with the welcome I had dreamed of, waking and sleeping for whole years. "And you, Agnes," I said, by and by, "tell me of yourself." "What should I tell?" she answered, with her radiant smile. "Papa is well, you see us here, quiet in our own home, our anxieties set at rest, our home restored to us. And knowing that, dear Trotwood, you know all." "All, Agnes?" said I. She looked at me with some fluttering wonder in her face. "Is there nothing else, sister?" I said. Her colour, which had just now faded, returned and faded again. She smiled with a quiet sadness, I thought, and shook her head. As I looked at her beautiful face, she saw that I was looking at her. "You are thoughtful, Trotwood. Agnes, shall I tell you what about?" She gave me her whole attention. "My dear Agnes, do you doubt my being true to you?" "No," she answered with a look of astonishment. "Do you doubt my being what I always have been to you?" "No," she answered as before. "You have a secret," said I. "Let me share it, Agnes." She cast down her eyes and trembled. "Agnes, ever my guide and best support, if you had been more mindful of yourself and less of me when we grew up here together, I think my heedless fancy never would have wandered from you. But you were so much better than I, so necessary to me in every boyish hope and disappointment, that to have you to confide in and rely upon in everything became a second nature, supplanting, for the time, the first and greater one, of loving you as I do. When I loved Dora even then, my love would have been incomplete without your sympathy. I had it, and it was perfected. And when I lost her, Agnes, what should I have been without you still? Closer in my arms, nearer to my heart, her trembling hand upon my shoulder, her sweet eyes shining through her tears on mine. I am so blessed, Trotwood. My heart is so overcharged, but there is one thing I must say." "Dearest, what?" She laid her gentle hands upon my shoulders and looked calmly in my face. "Do you know yet what it is?" "I am afraid to speculate on what it is. Tell me, my dear." "I have loved you all my life." We were married within a fortnight. Clasped in my embrace, I held the source of every worthy aspiration I had ever had. "Dearest husband," said Agnes, "now that I may call you by that name, I have one thing more to tell you. Let me hear it, love. It grows out of the night when Dora died. She sent you for me." She did. She told me that she made a last request to me and left me a last charge. And it was that only I would occupy this vacant place. And Agnes laid her head upon my breast and wept, and I wept with her, though we were so happy. And now, as I close my task, I see before me the faces of those who fill my life still, Aunt Betsy, Peggotty, Mr. Dick, Traddles and his family. But one face shines on me above all others. I turn my head and see it, in its beautiful serenity, beside me. O Agnes, O my soul, so may thy face be by me when I close my life indeed. So may I, when realities are melting from me, like the shadows which I now dismiss, still find thee near me, pointing upward.